नमोस्तु रामाय सलक्ष्मणाय देव्यै च तस्यै जनकात्मजायै नमोस्तु रुद्र इंद्र यमानिलेभ्यो नमोस्तु चंद्रार्कमरुद्गणेभ्यः. Namaste. Greetings on Sitalashtami. We started this course on sense of past towards realizing Rāma Rājya on the Bhishmashtami, and we are concluding it on Shītalashtami. When we began the course, we haven't seen any kind of a serious rise in the situation of the pandemic COVID-19. But as on today, given that there is a second wave which is also being spoken of, let us pray to Mata Shitala that she protect us and also give us good health so that we can tide over this pandemic period. Today also is an important day. It is Easter Sunday, a very important festival for the Christians all over the world because it marks the resurrection of Christ. The importance of this is something that is noted by each one of us every time we happen to use the Gregorian calendar or the common calendar, because the reforms to the Julian calendar and the adoption of Gregorian calendar happened because Easter Sunday is that Sunday which comes after the Pascha full moon day. So its relation to the equinox and the correction of the shifting equinox is an important element that we ought to keep in mind, given that it is something that we use tacitly without conscious knowledge of what all happens. And one thing that we can also be proud of is that this correction for the identification of the appropriate Easter Sunday could not have been possible without the adoption of Indian mathematics by the Roman Catholic Church. However, Pope Gregory, whether he has given a concrete direction not to take any pagan measures in finding the Easter Sunday, it indeed turns out, and we do have, say, certain historical accounts which indicate that the transfer of knowledge from the Kerala shores reaching Rome and the working out of Gregorian calendar, which only uses the civil days, the calendar which because of its adoption across the board is now what we consider as the common calendar. So greetings to all who celebrate Easter, and also an important point that memory and the sense of past that is embedded in the date that we use commonly across the board around the world. Today, there are a number of points that we need to bring together because this is the concluding session and this is fairly going to be a long session. And given that there are a number of points which require to be addressed, I'd like to give an outline of the manner in which one can look at the imagination that would enable us to try and address questions that might come in terms of working out our own ways of trying to address the issues concerned. The issues concerning our own imagination of how Rāma Rājya could be conceived in current times. I'd like to start with a story. And this story is the story just prior to the crowning, the coronation of Srirama as the king of Ayodhya. So 14 years in exile have been spent, and all these 14 years, there's a very clear indication that we get to notice that Bharata was ruling from a place called Nandigrama. And since Bharata was ruling on behalf of Rama by keeping the Charana Padukas of Rama on the throne, there is a fine story which we learn from our ancestors, and that is a story that I'd like to narrate today, because it has a very important aspect that one has to understand with respect to the nature of Rajya, or the state that we have today, and what we can indeed think moving further towards realizing Rama Rājya. So during the reign of Bharata, since Bharata was someone who was keenly maintaining all his energies in meditating on Rama, and he has given the entire burden of ruling to the ministers, all of who are quite capable. But since the Raja is in absentia, so there is a clear indication that was found that people, when it came to their obligation towards the Raja, which is in terms of paying a tax, they, in the beginning years, that is just after Rama went for exile, in the first few years, they were regular because they already had a habit of paying taxes regularly. So they were indeed paying taxes regularly. And they used to pay whatever was the thing that they ought to pay. And they never defaulted on their taxation. So it turned out that after the first few years, people also became slackened, and the reason being there was nobody to punish them, and Bharata was focused not on, say, the way in which how the Rajya was going on, though in fact he indeed wanted to ensure that all the kinds of instructions that Rama gave ought to be brought to practice. He found it overwhelming, so he couldn't focus on that. And that meant that over the next few years, till the end of this exile of Rama, a number of people defaulted on paying taxes to the king. And therefore, when Rama returned, it was noticed that the treasury was not filled as it ought to be. So then there was a serious thought as to how to make a correction, a course correction to this. So there was a plan which was chalked out, and the plan was that they'd indeed take the help of Dharma Devata and Hanuma, who could vary his form, whether it be in a very tiny size or to a huge size. So Dharma Devata was asked to assist Hanuma in terms of swinging a balance of scales whenever, when Rama ordered that all those people of Kosala Rajya, whoever ought to pay their taxes, they come and pay as much as they should voluntarily. So it turned out that amongst the various peoples of Kosala Rajya, there were some people who were indeed truthful, honest, all through the 14 years. So when they came and gave their due, in those days, following Manusmriti, the formulation was 1/6 of the total income of a household belonged to the Raja. So those who indeed paid all the 14 years, 1/6 of their income, they turned out to, they actually say had to pay only 1/6. And the balance, because Sarmatevata was indeed instructing, it actually indicated that yes, whatever was to be paid is paid. So then came the point where those who defaulted, when they came and paid only 1/6, then the balance showed that they indeed ought to pay more, because Hanuma, in a very tiny form, was actually handling that indicator on top. So I'm sure you would recall, say, when you go to a store which still uses the balance, and we also have this fascinating image of Dharmadevata with her eyes which are closed in our courtrooms, and also the popular cinema that we get to see. So the balance was something that actually swings to the other side only when all that each citizen of Ayodhya, Kosala Rajya, when they came and when they started offering whatever they had to pay, all that was to be extracted, which they did not pay earlier, was also extracted from them. And that resulted within no time, message went about that this is a magical balance, that those who paid honestly, it would treat them honestly, and 1/6 is of their total household income is what it takes. But those who haven't paid, because everybody knows what they have done, so it would indeed turn out to alter the 1/6 which ought to be paid. It will actually be something that might as well be 3/4 of their current income, because they have already not paid in other years. So this way, the entire Rajya was alerted, and they voluntarily came and said, we haven't paid, we are very sorry, please forgive us. And that way, Rama Rājya, the first act of Rama Rājya was to ensure that people were honest with their tax-paying commitments. So this is a fascinating story for many a reason. 31st of March, you would have possibly known that income tax returns were to be filed. And as you know, as on today, India has very tiny percentage of total population that pays income tax. And if one were to take the total taxes that are collected, then you would find that the share of the indirect taxes is probably much more than the direct taxes. And the other point that needs to be noted is that based on the income, we have various slabs. That would indeed mean that there are a large section of people who would never ever have to pay taxes at all. And whatever they pay would be the indirect taxes. And going by the principle of 1/6 of the total income, the legend goes that if it was a case of a person who is living on Diksha, and that person gets 6 rupees a day, then of that 1 rupee goes to Raja. Such is the kind of formulation that is present as per Shastras. And it is to be noticed that such a kind of formulation indeed makes for an ownership of the Rajya by each and every person who is capable of paying a tax. Because taxes are paid by adults, certainly not children. So that sense of ownership of the Rajya, that this is something that I ought to do and I indeed do, that is something that today we aren't pretty sure, we are rather pretty sure that, say, such an ownership does not seem to be natural amongst our citizens. So in what manner can that be brought about is a question that calls for us to start thinking of not a welfare state, but a welfare society. And the building of a welfare society is quite a different notion from that of the building of a welfare state. And the idea of socialism, which is one of the ideals that is picked up by India, and it's also something that we find amongst our preamble, if it actually is taken to mean that it has to think of a welfare society and not a welfare state, which is indeed an alteration of the nature of how we understand a socialist state in imagination. If we think of a socialist society rather than a socialist state, and the idea that there is an obligation on a person who is rich to ensure that they provide for, support, and ensure that the poorer would stand on their own legs. That is an obligation which, when taken, we would indeed notice that the desired welfare society would possibly come about. And that would mean that the nature of our laws that are operative, that also must be altered, keeping this as the goal. As you know, the formulation of our Income Tax Act, with its formulations which take from the colonial precedents that are existent, that formulation with all the kinds of amendments that are made, they still do not have a creation of a welfare society in mind. And even to this day, we notice that the process of taxation is so complicated that many people find it difficult to think of what ought to be their share to be owners of the kind of welfare of the entire society that they are part of. That is because of the complicated sense of tax structure that we have. So this is the story one that I want to bring to your attention in this concluding session. And the second story is again a very important story, because this story is something that that is oft repeated when Mahatma Gandhi and his formulation of Rama Rājya, whenever he actually shared with the ideal kind of state of independence that India ought to be in, it was to be Rama Rājya. And because Rama Rājya is that state when even an instance of dog which was wronged could indeed get its due justice when it asks for it. So there is a reference which I find from Sri D.V. Ramana. I think, say, the taxation system in USA is something that may not possibly, say, capture what we are indicating here, though of course it might be much simpler. So it requires one to seriously, say, reflect on that, which we could do it separately. But for the time being, let me get back to this question. So the pointing out of 1/6 of the total household income is because there is a Shastra base for it. And how does one actually, say, think of it and ensure that such a thing is brought to reality in our own lifetime is a point that calls for great degree of churning. And I hope, say, that would indeed happen in the times to come. So to get back to the story on justice, This is a story where we get to know that there was a sadhu, a young middle-aged sadhu who was who took sannyasa, and as a part of his sannyasa, as you all are aware, that of the 4 ashramas, all the members of the other 3 ashramas are dependent on grihastha ashrama for their survival and for their living. So a sannyasi is to go for alms, and there are in those times, the story goes that there are fixed times when Diksha was the time that one could as well say go around and ask for. So the Diksha timings are fixed in the society, and that was then when every family used to wait for someone so that they could offer Diksha. As we have already seen, say, the society or a prosperous sense of a society that we speak of in India is that society which is not that which has highest GDP, but it is, or say, a highest per capita income. But what we generally see is the question whether there is subhiksha in that society. That is to say, there is plenty of bhiksha available for all those who seek it and who are indeed eligible for it. And there are, say, multiple types of peoples whose livelihood is solely on bhiksha. And to simplify it, all the people who live on teaching, they are people who are living on bhiksha, because there is nothing that they are materially producing. So the people who are performing arts, they also live on bhiksha. So that entire category of people who actually are dependent on bhiksha, there's a whole number of jatis which are called as bhikshavriti jatis in our society, whose state of affairs has turned out to be quite bad. And this is a point that has also been, say, reflected on by many a thinker in our own society. And how at all can we reimagine, say, the way in which this bhikshavritti can indeed be brought to life is a question that brings about a significant cultural change that we can expect in society. So that is a point that indeed has to be kept in mind. To get back to this story, so that particular day, so this sannyasi, every day when he went for bhiksha, there was a dog which followed him. And when he received his bhiksha, he used to bark because it also was seeking food. And this sannyasi would give a share of what he received to that dog. And since that particular day, this sannyasi got delayed, for a variety of reasons, he got delayed, and the bhiksha time was almost getting over. So he was in a hurry to seek bhiksha in the nearest possible household. So because it was already time for the dog, so the dog started barking. And since the sannyasi was already in a hurry, he got angered. And since the dog was following him and barking, so he decided that he was irritated and angered, and he beat up the dog with a stone that was found there, and that resulted in the dog receiving severe injuries. So this dog, it actually, say, went to the court of Rama. So this is what is the most impressive thing that Mahatma Gandhi used to share, that here this dog went, and the dog, clearly everybody could see that the dog was injured, and say it went to the court of Rama, and then it started barking, and people knew that, say, something wrong happened, which is why it is hurt. So then with the blessings of the sages like Sage Vasishta there, the dog could as well say, convey what exactly happened. So then people went around and they brought in this sannyasi who was the one who beat this dog up and inquired whether he was indeed the person who injured this. He said yes, and he also narrated the entire sequence, and he said, I am at fault, so please give me, say, due punishment. So this second point about, say, seeking due punishment is another very important feature of Rama Rājya, that whoever knew that they have committed a mistake, they voluntarily sought a punishment, because that was a society where there was a fear of not wanting to carry a backlog to Paraloka, where the kind of severity of punishments could be much greater than, say, what one could as well suffer in this world. So that formulation meant that people, because there was that strong belief system that the nature of one's life is to ensure that what happens in Paraloka is what requires to be kept in mind. And if indeed Iha and Para, both these worlds can actually be enjoyed, then nothing like it. But if in case, say, there is a choice to be made, then suffering in Ihaloka is better than suffering in Paraloka. So such was the kind of a fixed normative in the minds of people. So given that this fixed normative exists, so today, of course, it would actually be the exact opposite, because nobody would believe that there exists a Paraloka, so be it. So what matters is that what is the sense of enjoyment and pleasure that one can have in Ihaloka, which actually is the one that matters. So to get back to the story, so the sannyasi came and said that, say, I've indeed done. And now there was a serious question. So the established shastras, they wouldn't specifically indicate what ought to be the kind of punishment that can be given to a person who has beaten a dog. So there's no penal code that is readily available. So one has to as well, say, think up and discuss amongst the people and correspondingly state what ought to be the punishment. So then, because it was becoming difficult to as well think of what could be the kind of a thing, because you see the nature of punishment must be in such a manner that there's a relief also brought to the person who is injured, and he's already suffering, so that suffering cannot be alleviated right away. That pain is enduring, so giving the same kind of a punishment is also one of the things that got discussed. And finally, they felt maybe, say, it is better to ask the dog itself to suggest what ought to be the kind of just thing that ought to be done. So Rama decided to ask the dog, and the dog said, I would like this sannyasi to be made the Pithadipati of Kalinjara Matha. So then Rama thought for a while and then smiled and said yes. So he indeed felt that this is perfect. So he made the sannyasi, and the sannyasi went back very happily, thinking that, say, his beating up this dog has resulted in a state where he never would have to, say, go around asking for bhiksha, because as a Pithadipati, he'd have his disciples and he'd have an entire infrastructure which would enable him to get things done for him. So everybody in the court of Rama were surprised with this decision, and then they asked Rama, how is it that this is a siksha, a punishment? By the way, say the term siksha is to mean education, and the word, even though it is, say, in some languages used equivalent to a punishment, the sense of penal code as a siksha smriti, that formulation is fairly recent, but what it actually indeed means is that, say, the Raja, by way of his danda, is actually educating the person who has committed a crime to rectify and correct himself or herself. So in this instance, say, what is the kind of rectification that is happening? So that is the question that everybody asked, because here the person would not have any kind of a repentance, and he would probably be enjoying. So then then Rama was asked about, say, this judgment, and he said that let us ask the dog who has suggested this. And the dog then narrated a story, and that story is equally fascinating, because he said that in my previous birth, I was the Peethadipati of that Kalinjar Matha. I was very generous and very good in the beginning, and I considered it my duty, and also as a Peethadipati of this Matha, to ensure that it does a lot of social service. And I was in the beginning very honest about all things that happened in the Matha, and I earnestly worked towards ensuring that the objectives of the Matha were to be fulfilled. And as I was doing this, within no time, I started acquiring a sense of pride in the nature of work that I'm doing. And with that pride also came in a lot of other vices. Start thinking that I am the one who is doing this. I am the one who is doing this. And had it not been me, then there wouldn't be any other equivalent person who would have probably expanded and ensured that the scope of this Matha and the kind of activities that the Matha is taking up is something that can be, say, strengthened and also increased. So given this nature of creeping in of the kama, krodha, lobha, moha, mada, matsarya, it started with mada, and gradually, say, the ahankara and mada, both of which ensured that all the other ripus, the enemies of man, they also started acting on him. And by the time he passed away, he acquired enough papa in life that he ended up being born as this dog. So when I actually became the Peethadipati of Kalinjar Matha, I was someone who was earnest and who is not short-tempered. I was generous. I had these qualities. And if this person who is so short-tempered so as to beat me black and blue, he is made the Peethadipati of that Kalinjar Matha with all the kind of powers that he has at his disposal, he'd probably be overwhelmingly increased with these kinds of enemies, and that would lead to probably a hina janma than what I got in this birth. So I think, say, for the kind of pain that he caused me, this is what I felt was the appropriate kind of punishment. And so this is where the story ends. But one could as well probably think that Rama, as the just ruler, would probably also ensure, because this is a story which would spread like wildfire in any of the entire kingdom. So it would also reach the ears of this sannyasi who would become the Peethadipati of Kalinjar Matha. And that would indeed make him all the more cautious not to actually, say, fall into the same trap that this former Peethadipati, who now became the dog in his next birth, has actually committed. So this story of the remarkable justice that Rama Rājya could also offer is one of the legendary folklore about Rama Rājya that we get to hear. Now, please notice that, say, the notion of justice in this is not something that limits itself to what we call as social, economic, and political justice, which is what the preamble of the Constitution of India speaks of. There is a much more subtle sense and a deeper sense of justice that is being spoken of. And that sense of justice is something that we indeed ought to strive for, because the sense of that kind of a justice is what also is captured when we look at the motto of the Supreme Court of India, which says Yato Dharmas Tato Jayaha. Whether that is currently, say, consciously kept in mind or not is a separate question, but that indeed is something that provides us with that kind of a guidance from where the action in the present could possibly be thought of. So, in our previous discussions that we've had on the sense of the points that we were referring to within the preamble of the Constitution of India, the terms sovereignty, secularity, socialist nature, democratic, republic, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, unity, integrity. These are the key terms that one finds in the preamble, apart from the start, which is we the people. So we have actually, say, had some brief discussions on it. So since this session, this week's session are about Sanatana Maryada and Sanmata Siddhanta, what is the Sanatana view of looking at, say, these principles, liberty, equality, and fraternity? And that is a question that is a good question to ask. And it is also something that we can actually, say, pose and look at the senses in which, say, this could make sense in the context of Shastras, which are the ones, when followed properly, one would find moving towards realizing Rama Rājya. Rama Rājya by itself has a few points which are more than a Rajya that is ruled or governed based on Shastras. It has something more to it, and that more is because, say, Rama as the ruler was someone who could ensure that all peoples of his were experiencing samadhi and resultantly also attaining moksha. So these two features, which are not the kind of things that you find in the reigns of any other king, that makes for the most important feature of Rama Rājya as the ideal Rajya that can ever be. So the fact that this state that exists, where even a commoner could actually experience the state of samadhi. Samadhi, as you are aware, is the 8th of the Ashtanga Yoga that one is aware of, and it is a very difficult state to attain for commoners unless there is great degree of effort that one makes. And Rama was somebody who enabled even a commoner to attain that samadhi. And it is in that samadhi that they would indeed get to realize the truth of reality, and that makes them ripe for moksha. So this is where, say, the point of the distinction of Rama Rājya as opposed to any other reign of any other Raja comes about. So given this very specific sense that is spoken of, it is true that, say, you cannot have any kind of a Raja better than, say, Rama at any point in time, in the past, present, or in future. So the steps towards realizing Rama Rājya would indeed call for what would it make for one to actually, say, have Rama be brought back as the ruler. That is a question which is not something that is completely, say, impossible to address, because we do have, say, the conditions under which, say, such a kind of a thing can happen. And that is a nature of thinking which would enable us to expand our scope of imagination from looking at things around the world just in terms of the here and the now. So the whether or not, say, someone who is not from, say, the Ramayana tradition or from the Hindu tradition, who wouldn't believe in this, even for them, if it is a myth, the key point remains that the sense that the myth conveys is something that actually has a great kind of a meaning which can be brooded on. So that sense of the myth is something that requires to be captured, and those who believe, there's no harm, there's no kind of a difficulty for them anyway. Now, the liberty, equality, and fraternity parts, which are actually spoken of, I have actually in an earlier session pointed out about, say, the criticism that is made by Nobel laureate and one of the Russian great thinkers, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, made. And this is something that I refer to, a reflection on the Wendy uprising. So I share my window so that you can take a look at this remarkable address by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So we are actually told generally of the glory of French Revolution and how it has altered the French society, but the resistance that French Revolution's principles accorded to the ideas which were generated by French Revolution, this is something that one doesn't necessarily get taught in the kind of studies that we get to notice. In school also, when French Revolution is spoken of, people wouldn't actually speak of the revolt or the war of the Wendies, as it's called. I'd like to read out, say, one particular paragraph, which is very important. It is this: it would be vain to hope that revolution can improve human nature. Yet your revolution, and especially our Russian Revolution, so this was actually being addressed to the commemoration of this War of the Wendies, hoped for this very effect. I repeat, it would be vain to hope that revolution can improve human nature. Yet your revolution, that's French Revolution, and especially our Russian Revolution, hoped for this very effect. The French Revolution unfolded under the banner of a self-contradictory and unrealizable slogan: liberty, equality, fraternity. But in the life of society, liberty and equality are mutually exclusive, even hostile concepts. Liberty, by its very nature, undermines social equality, and equality suppresses liberty. For how else could it be attained? Fraternity, meanwhile, is of entirely different stock. In this instance, it is merely a catchy addition to the slogan. A true fraternity is achieved by means not social, but spiritual. Furthermore, the ominous words "or death" were added to the threefold slogan, thereby effectively destroying its meaning. So all those who may have had, say, a study of French Revolution, would you have heard that, say, the French Revolution slogan was liberty, equality, fraternity, or death? To my knowledge, say, this the last or death slogan, which was part of the liberty, equality, fraternity, is something that I came to know only when, say, I came to recognize the War of the Wendies and the opposition to the ideas of French Revolution. It's a different story that the liberty, equality, or fraternity, when you remove these ominous words, that they could possibly be the kind of utopia that one desires, is something that many indeed feel. So if one were to take each of those concepts in exclusion of the others, they indeed are, say, considered as very important and desirable kind of ideas, which are to be as a part of any kind of a polity that is to be imagined. Who would say that there ought not to be freedom of speech or sense of liberty for people? Who would say, in fact, the feature of, say, seeking out liberty is possibly inherent in every human being. We can actually start looking at just born child. If a just born child is actually constrained, the child would cry. So there is a seeking of liberty that is possibly inherent in every human being. So liberty as a value indeed is meaningful. Similarly, say, who wouldn't want to be treated equally in the eyes of law? Similarly, it would indeed be correct to say that the appropriate application of law should mean that all those who have committed the same kind of a mistake are to be treated in the same manner. So that is a principle which is a principle of fairness, and that way justice and such an equality is also something that at the first sight there is no kind of an opposition that one can actually pose to it. And fraternity is a point where one can indeed say that, as Dr. Ambedkar rightly pointed out, that liberty and equality would not mean anything if not for an inherent fraternity or a feeling of fraternity, brotherhood, sense of brotherhood that a person has for the other. Without that, the sense of liberty or equality would not actually find their final shape in practice. So that way, for him, the sense of fraternity was almost nil, rather say a big zero in Indian society, specifically because of the hierarchical society of the Chaturvarnya. And that was something that he indeed felt is something that is devoid of any inherent appealing qualities. So this, of course, is the one that one can actually make as a kind of a analysis which is at the surface level for each of it. But when one indeed looks at in a greater detail, if one scratches the surface and wants to go a little deeper, then we do indeed see that liberty, equality, fraternity, for them to actually be in a sense of harmony, one would require to create conditions for the same. And what would be the best conditions under which these noble qualities, when taken individually, would find their best expression? That is a kind of a trade-off that exists, which has to be rightly struck for one to be in a position to enjoy all the three in its best form. So the Sanatana viewpoint would actually be the point which points out what are the kinds of ways and means by which the spirit of each of these is brought to practice with minimal kind of constraints that are to be imposed. So if one were to pose it as a kind of a mathematical problem, then the claim would as well be that that kind of a state where one would have the least kind of constraints placed for these three to be enjoyed, that kind of a formulation is Chaturvarnya. That is a formulation which indeed does get, say, spoken of in very many senses by some of our traditional acharyas. And I'd like to say, bring to your attention the sense of the universals which animate the kind of these views which are sourced from our sacred texts. Each of it indeed provides for a view that strengthens these individual ideas. So that way speaking, say the preambles placing liberty, equality, and fraternity is not a detrimental thing, so long as the nature of our interpretation does indeed take the spirit to a much deeper level than probably what we see happening in the current discourse. That calls for, say, digging deeper and also trying to understand these principles in much more clearer manner than, and it also calls for, say, a proper appreciation of the rich stories and the scenarios that one finds in our Itihasa Purana. Itihasa Puranas put together. So what are the kind of these universally accepted statements, which are the ones that ought to guide us towards thinking of realizing Rama Rājya? So one, Chandogya Upanishad says, Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma. So there is the Svetaswata Upanishad reference to Amritasya Putraha. So the sense of a fraternity that all of us, there is a sense by which we find in most religions that we are all children of God. But here, that sense of children of God may not extend also in the views of some religions to all types of beings, both living and non-living. When it comes to, say, the Sanatana viewpoint of Amritasya Putraha, then it actually calls for all the kind of beings, living or non-living, that are formed out of the Panchamahabhutas. They are all indeed, say, find their birth from that Amrita Swarupa, one who is immortal. Then there is, of course, the most, say, popular of amongst these senses. This is from Mahopanishad, when people refer to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that spirit of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which we also quite properly understand. It is about Udara Charitanam tu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So that indeed poses a question that if we accept this as one of these universal ideals which ought to be brought to practice, then how do we create people who have that Udara Charita? And Charita here means character which is built of the kinds of deeds that a person does in life. So that sense of Udarata and Udara Charita, both of which are to be thought of. And if the sense of secularity, so secularism, which is a oft quoted term in our current polity, if that sense of secularism, if it is indeed understood as that of the sense of Udarata that is embedded in this sense of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, then it actually offers us a different dimension of how we look at the way in which we look at the society around us. So taking the European meaning of the term secular from where it takes its birth as a separation of the state and the church is something that Indians could not do, given the kind of great role that sense of religion, even if it were taken to be equivalent to that of the more say weightier term as dharma. We have a clear case that it actually brings to our attention that the call for secularism here, when it is referred to as tolerance and so on, these are much weaker possibilities as opposed to directly relating it to this idea of the whole world as one's own family, and the creation of that sense of udarata in individuals is what we ought to see as the principle of secularism. So that is an interpretation which is indeed possible, and could be explored as well, and it would not violate any shastras that are actually, say, present. So that is one could say that such is a samskara that one can indeed bring to the meaning of the term secularism, given that it has become a popularly used term, and if at all it is something that is found to be a bad term and it is avoided, then well and good. We might as well say have an appropriate term like the udarata itself used directly. So how that happens and so on is still in the possibilities, space of possibilities that are existent from our own nature of activities that one can pick up. Sarvesham mangalam bhuyat. This sense of mangala kamana is actually at the core of how the term society itself is to be understood, is one of the key insights that I happened to learn from Professor Viśvaprasanna Pathak. I may have referred to it in an earlier session, but let me bring to your attention about it once again. So the term for the word society in our languages that we are using is samaja or sangha, neither of which, if one traces its own, traces the meanings of these two terms within our own language, we find that the sense of society that is found in English. So, whereas say when we use the term samaja, what we actually mean is, say, the English society. That is to say, the word is in our own language, but the meaning is not from our own language. It actually comes from, say, the English sense, which has more or less been universally, say, it has been sunk into the consciousness of people. So, at this time, there is a key point as a historian, as somebody who is very keen on the linguistics, and also as somebody who has great authority over the language of Rigveda. Professor Viśvaprasanna Pathak posed a question: how at all do we take the words which are in English and translate them to our own languages? What is the kind of approach that one can take? So he had this approach that he took, and he successfully showed that such a kind of an approach will give us fresh insights in terms of how we can look at our own selves and how we describe the reality in which we are present. So he says that the term society comes from a Latin root socius. And then he asks, see, it is claimed in linguistics that Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, all these three are sister languages, and Sanskrit being the older sister amongst these three. And they are stated as Indo-European languages. So, and amongst the, in the modern linguistics framework itself, if one speaks of Sanskrit as a language, then they would say that Rigvedic Sanskrit is the oldest, since Rigveda is stated to be the oldest piece of the recitations that one finds from across the world. So the question that Professor Pathak poses is, the Latin term socius, does it indeed have a Rigvedic equivalent from where we can as well try to say, try to trace an appropriate term for our own current requirement of seeking out a word for society? So he says indeed there is, and he would say that the term socius is something that has a Rigvedic equivalent in the term sakha. And Rigveda actually has a number of richas, which would say in the sakha, varuna sakha. So the reference to these richas is what Professor Pathak takes as a kind of ground to try and state that sakha varana is what results in the term varna. So this formulation actually gives a completely different meaning to the sense of how we understand society in our own language. Society is nothing but that kind of a collective which has a sense of common Sakha-varna. That is, there is Sakha is a term which is also used for friend, someone who one takes to be one's soulmate is also a Sakha. So to have a society that is so well knit, which actually has this sense and which seeks out for the Paraspara Mangala Kamana, such is the kind of a thing which the society with Varnashrama was his, say, kind of an explanation that starts from this question of what ought to be the appropriate term for society in our own language, because the term Samaja does not have any kind of a connection with either Varna or Ashrama. And what is it that is, say, the Varna that is happening? One would have to speak of the Varna to the Yajna. And that is where, say, all the, in fact, there is a corresponding shloka that also one finds that Bhishmacharya tells Yudhishthira that Chaturvarnya was actually, say, created with the intent that there won't be Varna Sankarya and Karma Sankarya, and they are directed towards the performance of Yajna. So this is something that also gives us a sounder ground to look at these ideas that Professor Pathak provides us with, which indeed gives, say, specific sense in which the sense of these universals which are actually given to us, which are quite popular, like the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is quite a popular point, but nobody actually takes an effort to speak of what is the kind of effort that one can make so that we can create people with Udara Charita. And what is the sense of Udarata that also requires to be understood? And Rama was indeed an Udara Charita, without doubt. So that way, Rama as an exemplar is something that we find is a very important element in terms of shaping the minds of people. And this is equally accepted by people who are not from the Hindu tradition also, because there is an entire list of deeds that Rama has performed. And I was in one discussion where say there was a discussion about Rama as Imam-e-Hind, the manner in which Allama Iqbal has pointed out. Today, of course, there is a kind of negative way in which, say, this is seen. But from the standpoint of a person who believes in Islam, to accommodate Rama not as an avatar Purusha, but indeed as a human being of an exemplary nature, that he is the leader who is the one who knows the way, shows the way, and goes the way. And Imam-e-Hind, he is the one who actually is the leader for the entire country. That need not be taken in a negative sense, but certainly something that can actually be seen as a ground from where one can think of a possible space for harmony, and also a space that can be created for a dialogue. So this is a possibility that cannot be, say, set aside as well. So what are the others which are listed? Sarvesham Mangalam Bhuyat. So the idea of society itself is something that has Paraspara Mangala Kamana, is what I just pointed out. And there's, you have Swastyastu Viśvasya. This is from Srimad Bhagavata, that the idea that the entire Vishwa should have a sense of Kalyana, a sense of celebration, a sense of a definite kind of good ushering in, is something that is indeed present. And this other point which is present is something that is found not just in, say, our own in Sanskrit or in Sanskrit tradition, but this is something that is found across the board in various traditions. That is Atmanah Pratikulani Paresham Na Samacharet. That which one considers is something that pains us, do not do the same thing unto others. this is a formulation which finds in much more crisper language, in German, in Latin, in Greek. You find this reference across the board because it's a perfectly fine maryada that one can actually think of. So the quote of Sanatana Maryada, to have this as something that one can keep in mind is one of the first things that one can indeed come up with. Sarva Bhuta Hiterataha. So from Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Of course, Bhagavad Gita speaks of the Daivi qualities and Asuri qualities in great detail. But the specific reference to Sarvabhuta Hiterataha, so that the sense in which we take into account not just an anthropocentric formulation that we currently have with respect to the modern day understanding of the world and also the nature of development that is there, to move beyond it and to speak of the entire world and the universe and all those beings, living and non-living, and thinking that one ought to ensure hita. Hita is something that one can only define it when one says that consequentially, even if, say, there is an instance where, for example, we find this instance where a young child might actually find it very difficult for the young child to take a bitter medicine and the child is suffering from some fever, then the mother would probably say sweeten it, and it might still be a little bitter, but she might as well say get the child to take it, and the child might as well cry because he or she may be forced to take it, but it is for the hita, because eventually, as a matter of consequence, one need notices that what happens on account of this is the good for the person concerned or for a situation concerned. In fact, the term what is satya is also something that is relating to hita. So there's an important point that Bhishmacharya tells Yudhishthira: to recognize what satya is not an easy task. And because it is not an easy task, it indeed calls for us to try and make a conscious effort to try and understand it, and consequentially that which indeed results in good, whatever is the kind of a decision that is taken, that is to be taken as satya. To understand what is satya is not an easy task, but to ensure that consequentially, eventually, it turns out to be to the betterment of everyone is what I take to be satya, is Bhishmacharya's formulation, and that indeed is something that we must keep in mind. The sense of this this consequential nature of understanding what is satya is also told in quite a famous story that we are aware of when one looks at this story from Mahabharata, where there is a thief who is running after another person, and this person takes shelter in the ashrama of a sage who is on a vow to speak only truth. And such a person, when he has actually, say, was asked by this thief, these bandits who were actually chasing this person, whether this man has indeed, which direction has this man gone. So that person, because he is on a vow for truth, and to think that, say, factually what happens is equivalent to truth, he pointed out the direction in which, say, the person took shelter. The person was found and he was robbed and killed. So the papa that is accrued is something that went into the account of this person who has actually revealed the location. And that way, we are told that when we have to speak about what is truth, then truth is not the same as the sense of a fact that one might have in mind. It is something which is beyond. And that sense of the beyond is something that can be understood because we are finite beings with possibilities for reaching the infinite, or say seeking the infinite, so long as we are finite, to ensure that our reach is only goes to a certain extent, we probably realize what indeed is true eventually. And it sometimes that eventuality comes about only because of a divine grace, or grace of a guru, or somebody who is more knowledgeable. So these are ideas which are quite strongly rooted in our own culture, which actually makes us think of the senses in which, say, we can look at and strengthening these kind of ideas in our society is what indeed would be a direction that one can think of towards realizing Rama Rājya. Now, when one talks of Rama, there is another important point that needs to be, say, brought to your attention, and this is from amongst the various Niti Shastras that we have. We have Shukra Niti Sara that says, Narama Sadrisho Raja Prithivyam Niti Manabhut. So Rama is not just a Maryada Purushottama, but he is the one who has the greatest sense of Niti. And his sense of Niti is always something that aligns with Dharma. And that is what makes it most important. So generally speaking, say, we do use the terms Niti and Dharma, and the senses in which Niti and Dharma are to mean the same in general, but when they are meant to be separate in their meaning, that is, when they are actually meant to be different in terms of their formulation, then we need to keep in mind that Niti is relating to the Ihaloka attainment of the desired goal, whether it be Artha or of Kama. Dharma is something that speaks of a state which is to do with what happens in Paraloka. So I have actually pointed this out in an earlier session also, that Dharma is something that indeed is something that has to do with Paraloka, and the non-reference of Paraloka in terms of Dharma would mean that, say, one doesn't understand Dharma even in the sense of a religion. Because every religion indeed has a world that is beyond this world. So there is a very fine kind of a point that Swami Karpatriji used to give as a kind of point to notice about what is the relationship between Niti and Dharma. So as we have already seen, that Niti and Dharma ought to generally mean the same, and the sense of they meaning the same is a sense of the manner in which you find wife and husband. Niti is the female, and Dharma the male. And if one were to think of it in this formulation, then in the absence of Dharma, Niti becomes a widow. Thereby, there is a genuine possibility for it to become fruitful, in the sense that it gives progeny. It indeed has to sway from the path of what is an accepted norm. And on a different note, when Dharma is not without Niti, that is, as a widower, then Dharma cannot get progeny. So the union between Niti and Dharma is what ought to be seen, and Rama was one such who in all his instances was able to achieve that. And that is something that stands out as a point that we can indeed try and learn, because this question of Niti and Dharma is something that we face in every aspect of our life. There might indeed be a case for attainment of a goal which is desired, and the means to attain that is something that one might as well find from Artha. But how do we actually acquire those means? That might provide us with a number of shortcuts, number of ways and means by which one can indeed say, try and take a path which may be easier. But such a thing would probably be short-lived. But if one indeed spends some time and ensures that all the parameters that actually are to be met for the Niti and Dharma to go hand in hand, then we are actually in a state where there is no way that one can have a loss that can come about because of the same. There are, of course, a number of points that say in variety of Puranas, in Ramayana, where we find, wherever we find the reference of Rama speak about, say, the sense of how the ruling, the manner in which, say, Rajya Palana ought to happen. He gave some very fine kind of indicators, and all those, they point out to one thing, that a Raja ought to ensure that knowing that, say, a person in the Ihaloka is, at the end of one's life, is not going to carry anything afterwards except, say, Papa and Punya, should make a conscious effort that he would not turn any person or any person, whether, say, within the kingdom or outside of the kingdom, as one's enemy. If there is someone who is indeed seeking enmity, then that's a different story. But one ought not make enemy of anyone, and that would indeed call for a person to ensure that their conduct is something that is polite, that always is living by truth. And we have a whole list of these, and the sense of speak that is there, it must be something that is indeed sweet. We have this famous shloka, Satyam bruyat, priyam bruyat, na bruyat, satyam priyam, priyancha na anrutam bruyat, esha dharmaha sanatanaha. That only truth that is also pleasing is what ought to be spoken. And at other times, silence is better. And if indeed, say, one is actually an advisor to a king, and the king turns out to be somebody like, say, Hiranyakashipu or Duryodhana, then what is the manner in which, say, one can actually say, what is it that one ought to do? So there is a suggestion that Kautilya gives in Arthashastra, that if at all there is such a kind of a state that comes about, then so long as the person can, because, say, in such a scenario, say, the truth is what is accepted as a falsity, and falsity is what is accepted as a truth. In such instances, one must refer to the case being as an instance of remaining silent. And if one has a great degree of affection for the ruler, and you indeed want to do good, then the suggestion is that indicate the unpleasant truth in private, but never in public. This is Niti, and this is also Dharma. So remaining silent in the instance where truth is falsity and falsity is truth is certainly Niti and also Dharma. But if at all one indeed has, that would mean that, say, one is ready to as well experience and accept whatever are the consequences that come with it. But if at all there is a sense that a change could be possible, a definite sense by which, say, you feel for the kind of direction that a person is taking, that be corrected, and there's an obligation that one finds for oneself because you are knowledgeable and you indeed want to do so, then the suggestion is that that be done in private, not in public. So this way, noticing the acts that are described of Rama wherever he is referred to in our classic poets, in Sanskrit or even in our own languages, may not be, say, contemporary in all instances. Wherever we have a Shastra Kavi is certainly different from, say, Samanya Kavi. Shastra Kavi is one who is aware of Shastra and ensures that his Kavitva is indeed embedded with the richness of Shastra in it. Wherever they speak of Rama, one indeed finds so many different kinds of points that one can actually collect. And that itself is something that offers a great space for understanding what makes for, say, the sense of Maryada Purushottama that Rama is. So this actually is a first part of, say, today's concluding session that I wanted to bring to your attention. We can take a short couple of minutes break, and I'll start, say, the second part of what I actually referred to yesterday in past, while, say, ending the session on Sita's Kitchen and the critiquing of Sita's Kitchen, about the sense by which, say, one can talk of the hereditary vocations, and that is something which today is seen as a kind of serious problematic thing. How do we as well understand it? That we'll do take up in a couple of minutes. I hope if you, in case you intend to want to have a short break, you could indeed take it. It's 5:57 now. We'll start at 6 o'clock. So let us move on to the second part of this concluding session. Now I want to bring your attention back to the discussion that we did yesterday. And this discussion is something that is based on the book called Sita's Kitchen by Professor Ramchandra Gandhi. And one of the kinds of things that we've actually tried to address in this is that the nature of the sense of past that Sita's Kitchen speaks of, in spite of the part that it takes the references to Pauranika myths, which are actually animating several kinds of decisions and the kind of ways and means by which one can think of future possibilities. While this is actually indeed a point that does get discussed as part of Sita's Kitchen, when one looks at it with sufficient detail, then it is difficult to place it in a manner where it follows any specific darshana without violating it. So there is a certain kind of a intermixing that is done as part of this towards directing what ought to be the kind of future that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi gives. And this sense of Bhavasankarya, which I referred to, is something that requires attention. And in terms of the Chaturvarnya as focusing on avoiding Varna Sankarya, Karma Sankarya, it is important to notice that there is a great degree of dissent that one finds when one speaks of Karma Sankarya, because there is a clear sense by which one would find that a question that gets posed, something which is more rhetorical in its nature, and that rhetorical question that gets posed is, if at all my ancestors were manual scavengers, should that mean that I also be a manual scavenger? This is one rhetorical question with which, say, many other points that are associated with the continuation of hereditary vocations are generally set aside. And indeed, it is the case that when it comes to the varieties of freedoms that are offered as part of the Constitution of India, the freedom to choose the kind of profession and also to choose the way in which one can earn a living is one of the fundamental rights that is offered by the modern Indian Constitution. If one looks at, say, the way in which this unfolds, we can clearly notice that the right to earn is something that wouldn't find a serious place in terms of the past that was prior to the modern world that we are currently part of. What indeed existed was certainly, say, a right to live, where people would naturally point out that he is also a human being, the other person is also a living being, they also must be given a space to live. And that is something which is inherently present as a value that was present in Indian society, and that is from where, say, the sense of Subhiksha society also comes to the fore. So the key point that needs to be noticed is that this sense of right to earn, in the sense that is currently formulated, starts with first pointing out that doing a task which is different from that of one's own ancestors is one of the key aspects that one notices in terms of number of what we would call as modern day professions. It's a different story that even within the modern day professions, we'll find number of instances of this kind of formulation that a lawyer's son or daughter also becomes a lawyer, or a doctor's son or daughter also prefers to become a doctor. These kind of formulations that we get to notice. But when it comes to, say, several people who belong to their traditional vocations, kulavrittis, they are, there's a general sense in which, say, a pervasive sense of norm setting that happens, which would indicate that such a thing is unviable, and henceforth it is something that is better avoided, even if it is not actually, say, completely derided. It's a different story that we do find several instances of derision that comes in the sense of this manual scavenging story that actually is indicated. In fact, it is quite, say, quite interesting to study when exactly can a sense of manual scavenging come in a nature of society that, in the kind of society that we have, where in an earlier era, we didn't have, say, these constructed pit latrines, or the senses in which, say, people had a specific kind of a drainage system of the kind that is currently built. In fact, I happened to read a very fine kind of an account of this particular notion of the so very clean London that got into the minds of Mahatma Gandhi. So when, in fact, it is stated that around 1850s or so, several homes, people used to actually, say, relieve their selves and in some vessels, and these vessels contained feces which were actually thrown out from the window onto the street, and from there it actually went into the Thames, and it actually caused a great degree of problem to the Londoners. But by the time, say, Mahatma Gandhi reaches London, that was in the late 1880s, 1890s, this was tackled in a very, very systematic manner, and so much so that Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, that time observes his wonder at the kind of clean kind of toilets that one could find in London. But this actually conceals a lot more than, say, what is present. And this particular kind of a critique that I happen to read is something which is very fascinating, and I could possibly share that with you, where the current sense of Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which is there, it is still formulated in that sense of the manner in which we can think of massive drainage systems which would collect all the human waste at a single point, and then there shall be treatment of it, and then there will be a different kind of and then, say, the treated waters is what shall be used or released. So such is a kind of a world that we have currently built. But this formulation misses out on, am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the key point that I want to bring to your attention is that, say, this sense of aggregated waste disposal was not how, say, Indian villages had their formulation. That is something which is an important point to be noticed. And further, on a different note, the idea of, I mean, say, there's this famous movie which actually became quite popular for its championing of the cause of Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which refers to a term called sandas. Sandas is a term which is referring to the lavatory that was probably, it's a name of a company which used to make those lavatories which were used in the early part of I think it is post 1850 or so that they actually make their way into India. And there's an entire history of this, how the change of sanitation practices in India shift from, say, the erstwhile mode to mode where we have a collection of waste disposed materials, and we create, say, a latrine which is close by home and not somewhere out in the field when it comes to villages, or in, say, in modern cities, where this is collected and in a pipe and it is released into some open drains. So this entire formulation is something that is a fairly recent phenomena. And given this fairly recent phenomena that we are currently getting to notice, the sense of the manual scavenging that is found in India is also something that cannot be traced back to a long time in the past. It's a different story that many people still do not have, say, a proper imagination about how it used to be the case that people used to relieve themselves maybe 500 years ago. So there's a question that one might as well ask, what is the way in which, say, Rama used to relieve himself? This is a question that you wouldn't find any sensible poet who would ever write on, because this is something that is taken as a matter of a routine, which is something that people have inherited as a practice from which they would know. But it's a different story that our sense of amnesia about how our own society used to function earlier is something which is quite drastic. We are now left with, say, certain kinds of archival materials where say, British have probably written about it, or the ways and means by which some people might as well have an approach where they might go out in the bushes, but such a thing is seen as something which is a shameful conduct. These are certain values which have been crept in, say, fairly recently, but and recent in the sense, say, in the past so many decades. But the sense of manual scavenging, if one indeed were to trace its origins, people would like to point out to the drains of Harappans and say that since there used to be these drains which we find from the unearthed archaeological remains, what we find today is also what would have been then. And that way speaking, say, the manual scavenging as a practice in India goes back to 5,000 years, is a formulation that exists in terms of the discourse that we currently have. But my understanding is that this type of a sense of past, which is primarily based on reading the past based on the present, is an activity which is fraught with several kinds of problems. So recently I happened to say, listen to one insightful formulation that an Ayurveda Vaidya, if he were to say understand what is the kind of problem that a person is suffering from, let's say dysentery of a certain kind, then since, say, there is a designated place in which, say, all people used to relieve themselves, there, say, the Vaidya would go after the patient relieves himself, goes there, notices the kind, and then decides what type of medicine ought to be given. So this is a kind of an imagination that I heard quite recently. But the point remains that, say, the mundane nature of how people relieve themselves and what are the manners in which, say, the waste management that we today find as a severe issue, how it used to be handled earlier. These kind of questions have become research issues today quite possibly because of our own amnesia about what could possibly be a kind of more organic way of living. And that amnesia, and then say making a kind of a value statement in the sense that the hereditary vocation of a kind is only in the negative sense, is something that is a problematic story. But it is very insightful to notice that in the very recent times, we do find some very interesting popular folk songs that I happen to listen to, which actually point out that the leather workers, they point out that their own sources of income have been removed because of the advent of companies like Bata. So today, if we were to buy shoes or buy any kind of footwear, we do not think of going to a cobbler. Most cobblers would actually be, say, still present, and they would probably be in some corner of a city or a village where they might as well be repairing, say, whatever are the shoes that one might buy in when it comes to a middle class or upper middle class or a scenario, where you would find that what one buys in Bata or some such multinational companies, what they create is what is actually found. And a cobbler, who earlier could actually be an independent person producing, say, footwear, now becomes a tool, a person who is an employee of a larger conglomerate. This is a certain definite kind of social change that we get to notice. And this is certainly not in the light of what traditional Indian society was like. We do have a sense where, say, family, if it were to cater to its footwear needs, it was associated with a particular cobbler family to whom only they go. And whatever are the requirements, they actually relate it from there. So it's a similar story with, say, barber. Today, of course, when it comes to the kind of people who are into the business of haircut and hairstyling, it has actually expanded again into a much larger corporate style, say, formulation, and it's a huge business in itself. Javed Habib's is case in point, and you will find so many such instances. So this nature of expansion of a corporatization, followed with the manner in which, say, the markets have actually spread out, have indeed created a great kind of stress on whatever are the traditional kulavrittis that are existent, which could function with a certainty of having their own livelihood and their requirements met without much difficulty, just by actually, say, going about doing what they would regularly do without having to, say, stretch themselves out of their own location. As we have already noticed that in a previous session, I made a mention that Martin Heidegger, one of the greatest 20th century philosophers, points out that the sense of modernity is actually about driving people homeless, and, or say, moving them outside of their home onto somewhere outside. So this sense of homelessness can come about when, say, the sense of livelihood is something that cannot be found from one's own home or what one does at home. One indeed has to fight in order to move out and then, say, attain whatever the livelihood has to be fought for. So right to earn is something that takes a greater precedence over what used to be the kind of thing that was very strongly, say, desired, which is right to inheritance. The right to inheritance is a point that you find extensive kind of debates on, and who are eligible to be inheritors, who are not. These kind of discussions that we get to notice, but nowhere in our pre-modern society do we get to seriously find instances of a right to earn. You do find that, say, people who are desirous of earning, they would take up business, and we have the stories that come from Mritchakatikam, where Charudatta, Brahmana, is into business, and his discourse on poverty is something that very clearly asserts that India is not a povertarian society, or say something that embraces poverty. Charudatta laments that I've been pushed to such a poverty that I cannot actually give bhiksha to someone who asks me. In fact, one of the key points that we get to learn is that amongst the Ashta Daridrya, which are spoken of, one is that if one is unable to give alms to a person who has asked for it, that is also a Daridrata. Now, this kind of a conceptual richness is present in the kind of ideas about the nature of society that is present, and to rhetorically dismiss it by a kind of point where one refers to manual scavenging, such a kind is something that only does harm to people rather than, say, alleviating, because it is trying to embrace such a modernity whose say consequences are now to a large extent being seen to be negative for many people, because to actually make a living in modern world calls for taking great pains, and possibly also going a step beyond, say, taking pain. One might as well have to give up those which one values, those values that one may have inherited from one's own ancestors. So such state is something that is indeed a great kind of distress that our society is currently in. And it is good to see that, say, those communities which actually have been, say, distressed because of this, they are the ones who are singing songs against corporatization, the ones who are singing songs against this. But their embrace, the moment it actually happens to, say, a socialism or a communism, what would it indeed mean is that, say, their own relation to their ancestors, and this because communism, socialism, capitalism, all these formulations in their current forms, they are not the sense in which, say, the societies in India functioned. And as I pointed out to you earlier, it is these points which were critiqued with every kind of idea which has been, say, articulated, that in a sense has shaped the kind of modern polity that we live in, that we find Swami Karpatriji write his Marxvada or Rama Rājya, where to what extent one can actually look at capitalism as meaningful. So current day capitalism and people within, say, the Western society, one of the best kind of authors that Bill Gates, who indeed finds, say, capitalism as a way forward for change and human endeavor to alter the world, is also something that is dependent on the kind of embrace of technology and improvements of technology that humans can indeed make. His favorite author, I am told, is one Professor Václav Smil, and he has always been writing books on pointing out to the limits of truth. And one thing that, say, modern world does not seem to accept or like is the term limits. Now, when it comes to, say, the point of Dharma Rājya or Rama Rājya, the idea of accepting limits to transcend limits is a point that actually is repeatedly referred to. And there is an example that one can indeed take, say, from one's own regular life. As a young child, to curb certain types of freedoms by the parents is something that actually enables the child to imbibe such kind of character, which can strengthen the child, and when he or she grows into an adult, they can indeed become independent. So the initial kind of curbs and the kind of aswatantrata that is actually, say, the child is put in, it eventually leads to the person's full-blown freedom, because that person is now shaped into such a person who has his own kind of a formulation of what is right, what is wrong, and that indeed leads one to lead a life which would be desirable in manners in which the person can do what he pleases, because what he pleases has now been shaped in a manner in which what is good. So to actually think of what is pleasing to be the same as what is good, and good in the sense of the term hita that I used, where one, when actually is performing it, when one is acting on that, it would eventually result in the benefit. That benefit again must be well defined. So in the context of the purusharthas, the attainment of the purushartha concerned without violation of the eventual attainment of moksha would be treated as that which is good. So there is a formal definition as well that one can give, and thereby one can avoid the kind of trap that the play in Hamlet, where Polonius is stated to have said, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So that such a kind of, say, limitation is something that can be transcended the moment one is clear about the kind of attainment of the purusharthas, which are actually very categorically stated. And then we would not have any sense of difficulty in terms of understanding good or bad. So that is where, say, the presence of a religion indeed enables us to have a clarity about, say, what is the direction does one take. And that's where the sense of paraloka and the kind of ascent in paraloka becomes an important element. So that, say, the sense of this limit or any sense of curbs that are actually spoken of are seen to be against the sense of freedom is rather a very shallow understanding of the sense of freedom. And what one indeed ought to strive for is that sense of freedom where once attained, it would never ever chain us. And that is the sense of freedom that requires to be reflected on. And that is the sense that people in Rama Rājya enjoyed. So the moment, say, people even in current times pose that question as to what is it that is that freedom which when attained would never ever bring us back into any sense of a chain. That thought itself can indeed be taken to be leading a person towards realizing Rama Rājya. So while this is, say, a point that I do want to bring to your attention in terms of these the senses that one has, I have to bring to your attention the judgment of Ayodhya. Now, there is an important point that I want to bring to your attention. See, so long as there is this sense where one starts by looking at what happened in the past is something that is a thing which cannot be undone. And it is something that is indeed adharma or unjust. Then such a kind of a formulation is something from where one cannot possibly, say, find a space to look at and realize a sense of justice. In the story of this justice for the dog, the reference the moment it actually stretched to previous birth and also to the next birth, that say trans-temporality and the sense of the transcendent nature of the justice that is spoken of, that actually adds to a great degree in terms of our own ability that one can look at in terms of what is happening. Now, there is a point that I wanted to bring to your attention about the Ayodhya judgment, where the Honorable Supreme Court, on the one hand, decided that the disputed title ought to go to the Ramlalla Virajman, and on a second note, also points out that the Shebite rights of Nirbohi Akhada are also to be served. And since, say, the Sunni Waqf Board, the representing the Muslims, have been deprived of their place of worship because there has been a demolition of the Babri Masjid, by exercising an extraordinary power that is granted by the Constitution of India to the Supreme Court of India to Article 142, there has been a ruling that said that the Muslim parties be given 5 acres of land as a redressal measure. Now, this is something that goes back to a formulation which, as we have read, say, in Sita's Kitchen, where there was a point that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi, even before, say, this fall of this demolition of Babri Masjid took place, we actually noticed that this argument was already in place. Relocate the mosque somewhere else, although it deserves to be destroyed, and reconstruct at the liberated site the original temple, or build a new one commemorating the birth and birthplace of Rama. So such is the kind of, in Professor Ramchandra Gandhi's words, vindictive demand of Hindu assertiveness today in Ayodhya. Now, for those of you who have carefully observed the kind of post-judgment vocal voices, who have found that this judgment is actually building on the nature of judgment that the Allahabad High Court has delivered, which many people call as a panchayat judgment, by trifurcating the disputed title amongst the 3 parties who have actually given, and then say, since there is a faith involved with respect to Ramlalla Virajman, the central dome of the place within the central dome of the demolished Babri Masjid goes to Ramlalla Virajman, and then, say, the left and right are given to the Nirmohi Akhada on one side, and then to the Waqf Board on the other, Sunni Waqf Board on the other. And this is what got challenged in the Supreme Court. So since this is the precedent on which the Supreme Court was indeed, say, ruling, possibly they could not have, thought of a judgment which was different from, of course, the other singular judgment that, because the Allahabad High Court judgment was a 2-1 judgment, and that single judge who ruled the entire location to Ramajanmabhoomi, he basically was happy to point out that that place has an Adhidevata Dharana in it, and it is to be treated as Swayambhu Kshetra, and therefore it is to be entirely delivered to the Ramlalla Virajman and the devotees of Ramlalla Virajman. So such was the kind of judgment that is delivered in there. The Supreme Court, in its first paragraph of the judgment, actually says something very interesting, and this is a very profound statement. The history and culture of this country have been home to quests for truth through the material, the political, and the spiritual. This court is called upon to fulfill its adjudicatory function, where it is claimed that 2 quests for the truth impinge on the freedoms of the other, or violate the rule of law. So when it came to the question of two quests for the truth impinging on the freedoms of the other, that part has been, say, categorically addressed by claiming that the sense of worship and the kind of special significance that Ayodhya holds and the place Rama-janmabhoomi holds for the faith of Hindus is something that indeed has a place. Whether or not, say, these are the words that are used, the kind of summary that I'm making cannot be stated to be incorrect. So that part has been, say, adjudicated. And by adding this or violation of the rule of law, there is a pathway made for this exercise of the provision of the extraordinary provision that has been, say, accorded to the Supreme Court by the Constitution of India, which is by actually, say, invoking Article 142. That is what, say, this specific, say, judgment did, and that enabled the possibility of it. So today, so there are people, say, like our own, so I am from Hyderabad, and the Member of Parliament from Hyderabad, Shri Asaduddin Owaisi, he has made a statement, and because he is a lawyer himself and quite a good lawyer at that, he has stated that what the Supreme Court has stated is something that is very, very disappointing judgment. And he also asserted that the sense of Babri Masjid and the memory of Babri Masjid is something that we would never forget. And we shall indeed tell that, say, what stands or what is going to be constructed was actually on the land of land where Babri Masjid stood. So this is the sense in which, say, that was pointed out. And there are, of course, other voices which would say that such a kind of a statement was something that does not ease the kind of communal tension that this entire case has caused. So such is a kind of point that actually is in there in the public space. And on the other hand, one of the things that I actually brought to your attention was this reference to the interaction between Puri Shankaracharya ji on the one hand and Pejawara Swāmī-ji, Sri Viśvaprasanna Swāmī-ji in the November of 2019 when they both got to meet. That was a very significant meet, and I have actually sent that say YouTube link for you to take a look at. And there, the effort, and Puri Shankaracharya ji was at Ayothya very recently, and he has been of this very assertive standpoint, and he has also made it declarative in a declaration, not once, but many a times, that the entire question of Rama-janmabhoomi ought to be seen in the post-partition India. And since it is post-partition India where this is happening, there is indeed a case for the most important, so he uses the word Manabindu, that is the Bindu, I guess say the appropriate translation for this Manabindu would be that kind of pointers which are significant for the respect that one gives within one's own tradition. So Rama-janmabhoomi is one such Manabindu for the Hindus, and the reclamation of it should not have had any kind of a trouble. It should have been done right after the post-partition scenario in which India found itself to be in. And because the sense in which, say, partition happened on account of religion. Now, this is a point where, say, the key question of the choice that Indian National Congress made, as opposed to that of the leaders of All India Muslim League, that is where, say, the question of the two-nation theory stood. And today, when we speak about the kind of political changes that have happened post the kind of almost revocation of the substance of Article 370, we have more or less come to accept that partition is a reality. Whereas so long as Article 370 was there, the claim of Indian National Congress and their politics meant that the sense of Jammu and Kashmir, which is a Muslim majority state, yet is part of the federal polity, that is India, with its own separate constitution, what it meant is that the idea of two-nation theory is false. So the moment, say, the Article 370 and its substance and the integration of the entire thing happens, then the fears which were actually expressed by many people seeking out the federal polity rather than a unitary polity in India, that is something that is at question. And the sense of the secularism that a Muslim majority state can indeed be part of the Union of India, this was the kind of narrative which Indian National Congress has built over the past 70 odd years. And that is now being, say, revisited by the kind of actions that the current government has been taking. So since there is no proper kind of an analysis of what these mean, what we indeed have is a loss of, say, a moral anchor that was possibly existent earlier in the form of the term secularism, which was actually to be found in the text of the Constitution by such measures as the presence of the federal polity, which respects for the kind of agreements that were there in the Jammu and Kashmir, that were actually made with the Jammu and Kashmir rulers and subsequently the later, say, leaders of the people there. So it is quite important that, say, the judgment on Ayodhya and this, say, reference that is made about the point of the extraordinary jurisdiction that Supreme Court actually exercised in order to do what they called as complete justice by giving 5 acres of land, whether it would indeed be the kind of complete justice that they desired. That is a question which has to be grounded elsewhere, because what appears to be just may not be just as well. And this calls for, say, a serious kind of reflection about the theories of justice that one indeed have. And since the term violation of the rule of law happened, the explanation of the violation of the rule of law is quite straightforward. That is because when, say, the tensions with the Rama-janmabhoomi movement were at a peak, there were formal kinds of assurances that were given by the government of India to the Supreme Court of India that no harm shall happen to the quote-unquote disputed structure or the Babri Masjid. That it is Babri Masjid has been confirmed by the Supreme Court judgment, but earlier it was a disputed structure. So the disputed structure or Babri Masjid, this kind of a separation was indeed maintained, and one would find that, say, the protection of that did not happen because of what happened on the 6th of December 1992 in the Common Era. So the Supreme Court, which received this assurance, has a sense of maryada, which it intends to, say, uphold. And in order to ensure that particular maryada is upheld, that we understand that the Supreme Court has had to invoke this extraordinary jurisdiction that they were accorded with. Now, does that mean that, say, the sense in which what Puri Shankaracharya has said, or what the sense of Hyderabad Member of Parliament, Shri Asaduddin Owaisi, what he said, they do not have a place of truth of their own? That indeed is the point, and that is indeed the contentious part of the sense of the truth quests or the beliefs. So, what is interesting and important to notice is that the two quests for the truth impinging on the freedoms of the other, this has been taken to be separate exercise from that of the sense of the rule of law. This term, the rule of law, is something that has a great importance in terms of modern Indian polity. The sense of this, if one looks at the historical antecedents of where this rule of law comes from, then one would have to go to the sense of Norman conquest on the English in England, and then there were a set of feudal lords who were all, say, in possibly not a direct sense, but in a similar sense, what Indians would call as Samanta Rajas. So you had, say, a sense of these feudal lords, and the sense of the rule of law. I'm actually, say, summarizing in rather crude manner, but one could as well go ahead and read this historical antecedents. There is a certain set pattern in which, say, the kind of polity shaped up with the Norman conquest, and certain things settled down, and whatever got settled down, and to preserve that state of whatever is the kind of maryada that set in there, that was actually given the name rule of law. This is something that when we bring it to, say, Indian context, would it indeed mean that, say, rule of law is rule of dharma? That, because dharma is a term that has had great kind of discussions that happened in India, and this is a point which is of great importance if one were to indeed speak of Swarajin ideas. Now, there is a reference that one finds from within the Constituent Assembly debates that Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, who was a member of the Constituent Assembly in the initial part of the discussions, that is on the 20th of January 1947, he was speaking in the, if I'm not wrong, that's the date, he was speaking in the Constituent Assembly, where he actually points out that the sense of rule of law is actually something that is present even in terms of the Upanishads that we have. And he refers to a point called Dharmam Kshatrasya Kshatram. So Dharmam Kshatrasya Kshatram is an indicator to say that Dharma is the one that is even above the Kshatriya. Dharma is that which ought to protect as well as protects even the Kshatriya. So it is above that. So that is a sense in which, say, rule of law is taken, because rule of law in the Latin formulation is reference to lex rex, which is law is the king, and not rex lex, which is king is law. So this is the formulation in which, say, the rule of law and the historical antecedents of this idea comes in. But in the Indian context, what ought to be a rule of law is a good question that, say, the Ayodhya judgment poses. And specifically in the post-partition era, and also the reflection on what is the way by which one can come to terms with partition, not in the manner in which we take it to be a point, but we need to indeed, say, overcome whatever is the kind of animosity that got built, because it's something that still has a great kind of impact in terms of the peaceful living by peoples belonging to different communities within our country. So it is here that one indeed has to reflect on, and what better occasion than to think of what ought to be Rama Rājya, where Rama indeed says that no person should be, say, considered or should be violated, because such a kind of a thing, when done to a certain person, then such a person might as well turn against the Raja, and he would as well plot a way by which, say, the Raja is removed from power. So why would a sensible Raja who knows that, say, the stay on earth is only for a limited period of time would create animosities and enmities with people when it can indeed harm him within the Haloka itself? This is a principle that indeed must be kept in mind. So the question of the rule of law is a point where I believe that it poses an important philosophical question, whether the rule of law, when it comes to India, can be anything other than the ability to resolve the conflicting or contentious truth quests or beliefs. And this question goes to the fundamentals of what law is, and certainly the question of what dharma is, and that must dictate the action for future and what is it that we can do in such a formulation. This is something that I believe is very important. And is it possible to speak of fundamental questions of adjudicating or providing for various truth quests, however conflicting they are? Can it be achieved by keeping questions of theology, ontology, epistemology, which are the very substance of truth quests? And how at all can these truth quest question can be addressed without actually considering them? You clearly see that, say, there was a conscious attempt made that the Supreme Court wanted to actually try to give a judgment within the framework of quote-unquote secular law. And that quote-unquote secularity is not in the sense of udarata that I just referred to. And what is the sense of udarata? Would it be in the sense in which what Professor Ramchandra Gandhi spoke of? Or would it have some other sense? These are questions that must be deliberated on. And that, say, such deliberation is not happening is something that I believe is also the cause for the kind of dissension and the animosity that we find in the world today. In India today. I mean, the world is something that comes much later. I want to bring to your attention one very important, say, shloka, which I happen to, because this question that I have raised is something that indeed is something that I find is at the core of what needs to be addressed towards realizing Rama Rājya. And this is from Mahabharata Vanaparva, where there is this famous meeting between Hanuma and Bhima. So Hanuma and Bhima have an interaction. Hanuma tells Bhima about what are Yuga Dharmas. He speaks of Chaturvarnya, he speaks of Krita, Treta, Dwapara, Kali Yuga. And in that formulation and in that sequence, he also tells what are the dharmas that you ought to follow. And he makes a very insightful statement. He says, Adharmo yatra dharmakyo dharmascha adharma sangitaha savikeyo vibhagena yatra mukhyantya buddhayaha achara sambhavo dharmo dharme vedaha pratishtitaha veder yajnaha samutpannaha yajnair devaha pratishtitaha. I repeat these shlokas once again and also tell what it means. Adharmo yatra dharmakyo dharmascha adharma sangitaha sa vigneyo vibhagena yatra muhyantya buddhayaha achara sambhavo dharmo dharme vedaha pratishtitaha veder yajnaha samutpannaha yajnair devaha pratishtitaha. The point that is being referred to is, say, there are instances where that which is which appears adharma but is indeed dharma, and that which is dharma but in actuality is adharma. Such instances exist, and that is a paradox of life. And in such a situation, it is only the wise who can discern between these two. And that discernment is an important element for a person to attain. And how does that actually come about? We've already seen this story of Dushyanta and Shakuntala, where Dushyanta actually speaks of Pramanam Antakarane Pravrityaha. He would say that I have never ever acted in a manner which went against what is there in Shastra. So what naturally comes to me, what naturally actually finds my heart desire cannot be anything but dharma. But such a kind of a thing is not everybody and everyone can at all say. It's something that only that person who has throughout their life, they have actually say formulated their life and their means of life in such a manner that is the life which can actually claim this. And why is that so? Because the achara that is actually referred to in here is something that finds its base in Veda. And what is Veda? Veda is that which is anadi and apaurushaya. Now this is where, say, the entire question comes to the fore. The anadi apaurushayatva of Veda is one of the very key aspects that one notices in the discourses of Mimamsakas. And when one refers to anaditva and apaurushayatva, that is beginninglessness and the authorlessness of Veda, the claim that is being put forth is that if one were to indeed find something which is unbiased, then it has to be authorless, because any person who is an author of something would mean, and even if that author is an Ishvara, the omnipotent, omniscient being, then even such a person might have a possibility of a bias. So what ought to be is a authorless entity, and Veda is stated to be that authorless, beginningless collection of statements of vidhi and nishedha, the do's and the don'ts. So such a kind of Veda based on which whatever is the achara that is built, when that is followed without any violation, and when that is practiced, because this is something which is completely in the deeds that a person does, then that kind of a person who is completely leading a life based on the karmakanda that is found, that finds its base in Veda, such a person, when without any such violation keeps on doing it over a long period of time, such a person would attain an ability where whatever comes as a desire to such a person, because of all this kind of effort that went in terms of practicing the deeds which are there, such a person would have a heart's desire which is nothing but dharma. And that is the way in which one can think of the creation of the Udara Charitas also. The sense Udara Charita Nam tu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So that Udara Charita creation is something that is associated with a great degree of karmakanda. And it is the irony of our times that we find a great degree of opposition to karmakanda, and there's a desire for trying to restrict or say simplify karmakanda that we find as a move, which is also possibly influenced by what we today call as modernity, that has more or less left out of the scope of creating such kind of people who are whose say word can be taken as dharma directly. Thankfully, we do have still such people that are say noble souls. So one such noble soul that that say we still have a memory of, in my understanding, would be Sri Viśvaprasanna Svāmī-ji. So the formulation, because say here was somebody who right from a young age of 8-year-old going through a rigorous process, having taken sannyasa and the rigorous kind of rituals that sannyasa ashrama requires, he has been performing it, and he performed all of it in the manner in which, say, one would expect it only from people who are exceptionally strong-willed to accomplish it. We had, say, such persons when we refer to Kanchi Paramacharya, who again, say, tells in his own reflections about his childhood that when he was given sannyasa ashrama, he was very young and he had absolutely no clue as to what to do. He had this sense inherent in his being that my guru has given me this task of this great pitha to be say handled, and that is something that I must do to the best of my abilities. And that spirit as a very young child, to take that ownership and the kind of responsibility, is what made him to strive to ensure that all that is asked of the ritual, it is something that is indeed performed. So that is the sense of the importance of the ritual in terms of the shaping of Udara Charitas, which can indeed have that sense of the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam feeling that exists. So when it comes to, say, this question of the demolition of Babri Masjid, my own understanding to start with was such that, say, it is something which is a thing which apparently is something which is a wrong thing to have happened. So that was the sense in which my own understanding began. But my own, say, reflection of this process took a very strong turn when I heard Pejawara Swāmī-ji, Sri Viśvaprasanna Swāmī-ji, when a young child posed a question. And by the time this question was posed, it was in his 5th paryaya, this is one of the things which has happened, I am told, only after 500 years. Udupi Krishna Matha has a constitutional structure where there are 8 disciples of Madhvacharya, each of who have started their own matha. And since, if I'm not wrong, Vajraja Tīrtha Swāmī-ji onwards, it is stated that there is a constitutional framework made that the Krishna Matha, where the Krishna Mandira is there in Udupi, its managerial aspect shall be dealt with by one of the 8 mathas in a given instance. So, and that happens for every 2 years. So since Pejawara Swāmī-ji was somebody who got his, who became a sannyasi at a very young age, he could actually become the Pīthadipati of Krishna Matha for 5 times in his lifetime. And that happened only once prior to that. And that was Sri Vajraja Tīrtha Swāmī-ji. So that is a very significant thing in the Madhva Parampara. So such a person who has led a very conscious life of very great uprightness, and he was asked a question, what are the 2 most memorable instances of your life? He mentioned the witnessing of the fall of Babri Masjid was one of the most delightful memories that I have. But this indeed posed a very important question to me as to how do we understand this situation. So the only kind of a thing that I can possibly think of is the sense that our own current language and the kind of structures that we are placed in, they do not possibly enable us to understand this particular sense in which Hanuma told Bhima that which appears as adharma but might be dharma, and that which is dharma might as well appear as adharma. And to be able to make these distinctions is where a person who is Vijna would actually find his place. So this is a kind of thing that I am able to currently say come up to. And I think that irrespective of what my own understanding is, the question in itself and the sense of how we understand rule of law is very important, because not just for one instance, but also about, say, what is it that we can think of about how we can look at this sense of our own current, say, world, and the sense of our say, constitutional polity. How do we turn it to mean in the sense in which, say, the traditions of yore are indeed respected? The second memorable instance that he spoke of happens to be the way in which he invoked Vaishnava Dharma to allow the entry of those who are called as outcasted untouchables into the Krishna Math. So this was the second point, and both these instances actually indicate a sense of dynamic interpretation of Shastra, and they indeed pose very significant materials for reflection. So I cannot go further on this, but I do want to point out that the nature of sovereignty that the current Supreme Court exercises is something that is constrained by its limitation to the question of popular sovereignty. And the day when this sense of sovereignty indeed is seen in the national motto, which is Satyameva Jayate, then we could indeed think of the Constitution of India as a framework which is created so that each individual citizen who is part of, who makes up the nation, that individual citizen be understood as a truth seeker, and such a truth seeker, when he is in his or her own truth quest, the framework, which is the Constitution, allows for and provides for the various truth quests. And when such truth quests are provided for, or say they are given space for, and they are allowed for, all the kind of rest of the activities that one finds in the Constitution is to provide such a space for the people to take up their truth quests to their respective, say, goals that they set as per their own truth quests. And so long as these truth quests are transcendent, then there is indeed a possibility of trying to find a way by which they are to be treated with due respect. And this provision comes with a condition. And that condition is that no individual claim to a truth quest can actually be violative of another's genuine truth quest. And this kind of a regulative principle, a regulatory principle, is what makes for the sense of the Constitution. And when indeed there comes a situation where one genuine truth quest is actually in conflict with another genuine truth quest, then comes the point of what ought to be the kind of maryada that can be put in place, which would resolve that state of affairs. And sometimes say it could actually be done locally, and sometimes it has to be globally done, and sometimes it might be restrained and restricted to that particular, restrained to a particular place, or restricted to a particular time. But that attainment of the essential principle of maryada is what one finds in the adjudicatory procedure, which actually enables for such a kind of attainment, is what ought to be the kind of sense in which we understand Constitution of India to mean. And then this principle, when applied onto each and every article of the Constitution, one can actually measure what goes in it and what doesn't go in it, what actually is meaningful in it and what is not meaningful in it. And in such a formulation, say, I can clearly point out that there are certain types of articles which would violate a sense of a truth quest, which is following Shastra, and that which actually is the truth quest that follows Shastra. So such a kind of article or set of articles are things which are to be revisited and given such an interpretation. If at all revisiting or say or changing them is not possible, then that kind of an interpretation is to be made operative. That would indeed ensure that, say, no truth quest is actually violated as a matter of the structural kind of setup that one is placed in. This is the abstract version of the same that one can think of. And then Indian sense of sovereignty is neither the sense of popular sovereignty of the US kind or the parliamentary sovereignty of the UK kind, but it is actually based on the sovereign principle of truth. And this possibly also sits well with the fact that the Constitution of India was written as a consequence of the Indian national movement, which was led by Mahatma Gandhi, whose goal was truth and his means was ahimsa. So that is something that one indeed can keep in mind. And then that also poses a question about, say, where exactly is the kind of limits on himsa, ahimsa, and these formulations, which are, say, perennial kind of questions which have been discussed as part of the Indian tradition. So just as, say, the case where we have observed that telling truth always is not something that is dharma. Similarly, being, following ahimsa in all instances is also not something that can indeed be claimed in all instances to be dharma. And specifically so when it comes to Kshatriya, who has Varna Dharma, which is indeed to actually go ahead and with himsa, if need be, and without, if possible, to ensure that there is an order that is indeed maintained. So that is a point that one cannot forget. And that brings me to the question of the current distress that we must indeed speak of about, say, how do we understand partition? It appears to me that, say, one of the things that I did share with you about, say, the way in which we can look at time calculations that are there in terms of our own tradition. Indian national calendar does not follow the calendar of modern Gregorian or the common calendar. So Indian national calendar starts its count from the Shaka era, and Shaka is a reference to Salivahana Shaka as it is followed in the southern part of India. Even to this day, I've already brought to your attention that the north of Vindhyas, even to this day, and including Nepal, they refer to Vikrama Shaka, Vikrama era, and Salivahana Shaka, Salivahana era. Salivahana Shaka is also more popular as Shaka Samvat, Vikram Samvat and Shaka Samvat. Now, I already brought to your attention that historically speaking, Vikramaditya or Vikramarka of Vikram Samvat and Salivahana of Salivahana Shaka, both these are considered as mythical beings. And that is one of the greatest kinds of disservices that we have in terms of the historical memory that we currently have. There are, of course, efforts that are made to show that there indeed was Vikramarka who ruled from Ujjaini in 57 BCE when he established his Vikram Samvat. But I do not know nor am I aware of any such conscious efforts to try and prove the historicity of Salivahana. And when one looks at Bhavishya Purana, which actually has a great reference to both Vikramarka and Salivahana, one notices that Salivahana was the grandson of Vikramarka, and Vikramarka established his Shaka, having defeated and killed so many Shakas. So there's a figure that one finds in such texts as Kalidasa's Jyotirudaharanam. And this text is a text which speaks of Jyotisha. And there's, of course, again, within the historical framework, people would refer to this Kalidasa is not the same Kalidasa who has written Raghuvamsa and so on. Though, of course, within this text itself of Jyotirvidabharanam, there's a shloka which says that I am the same Kalidasa who has written these. So people say that it's an interpolation. So you have modern scholars who consider that as an interpolation. And this particular text, Jyotirvidabharanam, speaks of 6 Shakakaras in the Kali Yuga. So he refers to, say, even future epoch makers. So just as Vikrama era exists, Shalivahana era exists after thousands of years. So they stated that the first era of Kali Yuga is Yudhishthira era. Then came Vikrama era, which lasted for a very short time. And then comes Shalivahana era, which lasts for 18,000 years. And then there is Nagarjuna era. There is a couple of others which I do not recall right now. So that makes up for 432,000 years of the Puranic scale of the Kali Yuga. So while you keep this in mind, the Shalivahana Shaka, the modern day Telugu film industry has made a movie called Gautami Putra Shatakarni and has pointed out that he is the one who started this Shaka. And that again is something that is problematic in its formulation. And I think, say, this movie also got, there's a Hindi version of it which also got released. So the key aspect that needs to be noticed is that the mystery of the personage of Shalivahana becomes important because Bhavishya Purana, when discussing Shalivahana, speaks of some things. I'm actually speaking of the text of currently available Bhavishya Purana, which many people would say has several interpolations, but I am actually stating it without actually taking into account what are the interpolations and whatnot, etc. It says that Shalivahana happened to see Jesus. Today is Easter Sunday, so Shalivahana happened to meet Jesus, later became Christ, and Easter Sunday is a reference to that. So there's a reference to Shalivahana meeting Christ, meeting Jesus, which is mentioned. And it also says that Shalivahana could not recover all the kinds of lands that his grandfather could win over from the Shakas, who were, say, a tribe from the west. So what he did was that he actually created a boundary of what we today know of as Bharata Khanda. And this boundary was beyond the river Indus. So that is, say, when you come from the west. So he marked the Indus River as a kind of a boundary between, say, that which is beyond and that which is on the other side. So towards the east of Indus, Sindhu River, is what you have Sindhu Desha, which is Hindustan, which is Bharata Khanda. And this is a very insightful observation that one can make when one indeed takes this and considers that Indian national calendar, though the entire North India and also Nepal and others, they use Vikram Samvat, we actually chose Shaka Samvat as the start of the Indian national calendar. So does it have to be related to the acceptance of partition reluctantly? Or if one indeed were to have a thought of, say, trying to remove this sense of partition, then we have to overcome both in terms of our own time calculations, maybe by going back to Vikram Samvat, and also in what manner can we indeed raise our own polity to claim that the kind of assimilation which Muhammad Ali Jinnah was staunchly against when he spoke of the Muslims as a separate nation, because assimilating would indeed mean that, say, what is distinctly true about Islam is something that might as well be having a great degree of Sankarya, where several practices of Muslims might as well start having, like I'm aware of, say, several Telugu Muslims who actually sport the kind of these ornaments which are specific to a Hindu marriage and Hindu marriage ritual. And they still sport them, and they do them as a part of their marriage ritual as well, which still happens in the form of the Nikanama, but these are still carried forward. So such kind of instances, people would say, are certain crossovers, or possibly say, one could indeed say that such a thing would make for Sankarya of the ritual practices. So this Sankarya, which is there, it could indeed be a cause for trouble in some instances. Like, for example, there are several rituals which are specifically unique to Hindus. Like, for example, say the Venkateshwara Suprabhatam, which is something that at one point in time used to be played. I'm sure possibly even now it is being done. All India Radio early in the morning used to play Venkateshwara Suprabhatam. So Suprabhatam is, say, the exercise that one finds where the Lord who is asleep is woken up by this song. And the first verse of it is from Ramayana. Kausalya Supraja Rama Purva Sandhya Pravartate Uttishta Narasardula Kartavyam Dayamanikam. So this Ramayana's point from where, say, Venkateshwara Suprabhatam begins, a similar kind of a ritual has been made in several churches in Andhra Pradesh that I'm aware of, where there's some inspired poet who has written Christu Suprabhatam, which is, say, following the same kind of a ritual of Christ who is on the cross, who resurrects, is also put to sleep, and he is also woken up, or whatever the sense in which that takes shape. So I am not aware of, say, the text, but say, this is a kind of a thing that one finds, and there is indeed a great fear that the increase in the kind of conversions, though people might still sport Hindu names, but they are still, say, Christians, is something that is enabled by this kind of a Sankarya of ritual practices. So here I'd like to bring to your attention, say, a story of a 1,000-year-old play where this very point was actually ruled by the minister of those times, is something that needs to be avoided. So I am actually referring to a play by one of the greatest Nayayikas of the Prachina Nyaya, by name Sri Bhatta Jayanta Bhatta, who has written Nyaya Manjari, which is possibly the pinnacle of Prachina Nyaya. When I mean Prachina Nyaya, I am referring to that which was prior to, which speaks of the 16 Padarthas of Nyaya Darshana following the Gautama Sutras, whereas Navya Nyaya started from Gangesha Upadhyaya and whose antecedents are found in Udayanacharya. One finds that Gangesha Upadhyaya's focus was specifically on pramanas, that is, what are the instruments for valid knowledge. So he refers to 4 of them, and they are extensively dealt with: Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana, and Shabda. So these are the 4 pramanas that we find Gangesha Upadhyaya speak of, whereas the Prachina Nyaya speaks of pramana, prameya, and the varieties of vada, and finally, say, comes the point of siddhanta. The term siddhanta that I used in Sanmata Siddhanta is something that is in the same meaning as the siddhanta that is spoken of in the because Nyaya Darshana in Gautama Sutras is actually a Vada Vidya. It actually tells the points where one in a matter of debate, where are the points of defeat. So you have, say, Nigrahasthanas, as they are called. So 16 of them are actually referred to. So the pinnacle of that is written by Bhatta Jayanta, and Bhatta Jayanta was a minister in a Kashmir court. So I'd like to say, share one particular, the last, say, Anka of this play called Shanmata Nataka and it is also called as Shanmatanataka. It is also called as Agamadambara. I'm going to show you, say, that particular, say, ruling which happened, and I'll also share, say, what is the kind of brief story about what was Agamadambara was about. So Agamadambara begins with, say, young Snataka, somebody who has just, say, finished his studies, and the Guru has given a permission for him to go out having studied, and he is a Snataka in Purvamimamsa. Purvamimamsa and Buddhism and Purvamimamsa is probably one of the staunch advocates of the Anaditva and Apaurushayatva of Veda, and it has, and if one looks at the debating traditions, one finds that the kind of blow that the Purvamimamsaka Kumarila Bhatta has given to the sense of the presence of Bauddha, the people who say took the stance of Bauddha, that is stated to be of a very strong kind. And Kumarila Bhatta is one of the celebrated names amongst the Purvamimamsa tradition. So Bhatta Sankarshana is the name of this Snataka, and he comes out with an intent to try and defeat all the rest of the darshanas and establish the supremacy of Purvamimamsa darshana. And it so turns out that, say, he indeed goes about, has debate, and this entire Nataka speaks of those varieties of natures of these debates that happen between Purvamimamsaka and say Bauddha and Jaina and Charvaka and Nayayikas, and also that of Pancharatragama. Pancharatragama is not Veda, but it is something that several of the gurus of Bhatta Sankarshana follow. So Pancharatragama is followed by Vaishnavas, and they consider that Pancharatragama is something that is to be treated also at the same level as that of Veda. And Bhatta Sankarshana was the one who says that Agama comes from an author. There is an author for Agama, so because whether it be Ishvara or through Narada, so there are multiple Agamas. So the sense of Agama, because it is from a particular source, person, even if it be a divine being, it cannot be something that can be taken to be of the same order as this. So Purvamimamsakas raised a critical question that the practice of Pancharatragama should not happen if at all they lose out in our debate. So this actually created a lot of furor in the kingdom, and what follows is a resolution of that kind of a dispute. So it is here that Anaditva and Apaurushayatva are spoken of, and then steps in Nayayika, because Bhatta Jayanta is a Nayayika, and Nayayika offers the kind of a resolution. And what is the resolution that he offers? He says that the claim for Apaurushayatva and this Anaditva has basically, say, been something that the others cannot take. So one needs to notice that, say, whether it is Anaditva or the Apaurushayatva that is spoken of the Veda, for it to actually come to practice in terms of the human usage, it has to be through some kind of a channel. And that channel is what we call as Ishvara. So Ishvara is omniscient, omnipotent being for Nayayikas, and they do not accept the Apaurushayatva and Anaditva of Veda. So that they do not accept it, and they further make a point about, say, this claim. See, here is the point where, say, they also point out the sense of the Maryada would be that it is said that Anantavai Vedaha. So is it the case that all the Veda that you are currently aware of, is it all that exists? Every Pandit would say that it is not so, because there are a number of aspects of Veda which are now forgotten. And how do we know that? Because we have Patanjali's Mahabhashya, which actually gave a list of so many shakhas of Veda, of which very few are currently remaining in the memories of people as on today. So that means there are several things which have been lost in time. Maybe there would be an occasion later where, say, through some meditative effect, all those things which are lost might as well be recovered. That's a separate story. But what Nayayika asks the Mimamsaka is that, would it not be possible for the Pancharatra to contain those elements of that Veda which is currently forgotten? And if it were indeed possible that such a thing can be imaginable, then what it means is that to deride, say, any person who says that there is an authorial version of an agama, which is that which comes from parampara of yore, from somebody who is very respectable, let's say a prophet, then such a kind must also be given the same kind of a respect as that which one would give to the Veda. So, such was the way by which Bhatta Sankarshana is faced with, because he as the official had to adjudicate, and he takes the help of Nayayika. And Bhatta Sankarshana makes a very important point. He would say that this is certainly the Niti to be followed. That is, he would distinguish as a Mimamsaka. He would not agree that Pancharatra-agama's rituals or the kind of ways and means that they follow, they would have any kind of a paraloka benefit that a Vedic ritual would offer. But for the temporal purposes, to let people continue and persist with their own rituals and deeds is something that is allowable as a matter of Niti, because it would avoid tension, it would avoid clashes, and thereby one can indeed say have a pursuit of their own deeds, their own karmas, their own traditions. And whenever there is any kind of a physical clash, then the ruler steps in to try and restrain those who have actually tried to violate. So that is one formulation that indeed comes in. So, but the key point again here is that, say, the question of dharma, which the Purvamimamsaka has taken into consideration, is not violated, because dharma persists, and dharma, as I have been repeatedly pointing out, is something that is to do with the paraloka bhavana. So such a kind of a niti was found to be acceptable to everybody, and everybody expressed their happiness at this Nayayika's resolution. So that doesn't mean that, say, the Mimamsaka accepts this point that it doesn't mean that, say, Nayayika's point has been accepted by just a second, I think, say, this got lost. Let me again open. Is this so that Nayayika's Mimamsaka's position, it doesn't mean that, but they have found a way out to actually say, let each one pursue and persist with their respective karmakanda and their own respective ways and means by which they seek what is the goal of their respective darshana. At this point, Bhatta Sankarshana, after accepting this, he actually says, very important point. So he says, Honorable Dhairya Rashi is the Nayayika. Be sure that in a manner of speaking, we have been revived, beatified, purified. This is a translation from Clay Sanskrit Library. I could share the original Sanskrit version also. So that in a manner of speaking, we have been revived, beatified, purified, nourished, made to experience the goal of this worldly existence by this novel river of erudition that your honor has generated. What I have actually summarized is a very crude version of the intricate kind of vada prativada that happened in these previous, say, sections of this plane. So you might as well say, enjoy this later. So the made to experience the goal of this worldly existence by this novel river of erudition that your honor has generated. How wonderful. What a subtle intellect. What a fluent speech. What a skill in the doctrinal and scientific works. What a mind exempt from such faults as envy. Or is there any virtue that has not reached its highest limit in this person? People have always said that truly no match for Shahata has been born. His original name is that, and he's also called Thaira Rishi. These professors are also very much capable of appreciation. So how could your honor not win them over? Shall I ask them? So everybody, he turns towards the disputants. Respected professors, has your heart been won over by Thaira Rishi's speech? Disputants say, sir, his erudition is superhuman at the very least. Sankarshana says, besides, your intellect will always be pure like that of Brahmin sages, thanks to these words of the Honorable Thaira Rishi, which shower inexhaustible streams of political wisdom. That is Niti there. Okay, the term political wisdom is actually a translation for Niti, and are uniquely fluent and immune from malice. Nevertheless, you are reminded again and again of the following. There are two things that you gentlemen must by all means observe. Disputants ask, what are they? These religious traditions, these agamas, these respective, paramparas, as we have been told, are not to be intermixed. The word used is sankarya. So you find, say, etani kila parasparam asankirnani. Asankirna is a reference to sankarya. Okay. So these religious traditions, as we have been told, are not to be intermixed in as much as each of them has its respective scope existing in the way they have been set up. That is, each parampara has its own formulation. So it might have its own kind of rituals that it has. So let not the ritual of one be, intermixed with that of another to generate something anew, because such kind of a thing can indeed cause confusion, can indeed cause heartburn, can indeed cause, dissensions, can indeed cause fights. And we do see that happen even to this day. In as much as each of them in its respective scope existing in the way they have been set up. So you gentlemen must always pay attention to prevent their confusion. Now comes a very important point. Disputants ask, sir, what can we say concerning all the universal piety? And piety is the term used for dharma here, taught by Manu. Universal is the term referring to samanya. Samanya dharma includes, say, ahimsa, asteya, satyavachana. So these are all the kinds of things that are referred to. So not harming another living being, not stealing. Now, these are, say, samanya dharmas that Manusmriti refers to, such as non-violence, which is handed down here in everyone's own doctrine. So you would find that, say, each of these samanya dharmas are to be found possibly in all religions, all agamas. So when you are actually asking for not intermixing, and if there is a claim that, say, the first one is Manu, so therefore it is something that is Vedic in nature, so therefore it must indeed be something that restricts itself only to that, and it doesn't work out. So apart from that, so apart from these, say, samanya dharmas which are actually present commonly across the board, however, we avoid the mixing of the specifically taught, particularly ritual sections, since we are afraid of acting against what is said in our own scriptures. So the disputants themselves are actually saying that we would not like our own followers or our own say, people who are following our respective thing to actually avoid this. So that intermixing is something that we would indeed avoid. Today, of course, we are in a very peculiar situation where, say, if there is such a kind of an argument that is made that such things are not to be done because we don't like any kind of limitations or restrictions placed on one's own desire. Since the point is limited to Ihaloka and there is no call for Paraloka, we are actually placed with instances where people would like to intermix things from anywhere and everywhere depending on one's own desire. And that desire is not constrained or restrained, which in turn causes all the more dissensions and possibly greater conflicts than what would happen when people have their own discipline in terms of how they go about their respective karmakanda. And if one is indeed, say, deep into karmakanda, then possibly one wouldn't find time to as well think of violating the others, say, ritual. Because rituals generally are such that they keep you busy from morning till evening, from birth till death, and after as well. So for those who are aware, who are alive, regarding a person who is dead. So such is the way in which the rituals in any religion or any kind of a formal structure that one is placed. And one indeed is currently placed with a very important kind of a dichotomy when it comes to, say, modern day rituals like waking up, brushing your teeth, and then going to an office, or maybe, say, sitting in front of laptop and logging into the office, which actually indeed has a great kind of an impact in terms of performance of Sandhya Vandana or so on. So the kind of rituals that come from the Parampara. So that modern ritual versus the Paramparic ritual, Parampara's Karmakanda, that is a point that indeed does not receive enough of attention, but the resolution of which is something that is done keeping Swarajin ideas in mind, is what would probably be indeed in the direction towards realizing Rama Rājya. So what the disputants are confirming to Sankarshana is that we indeed are not interested in Sankarya or creating any Sankirana formulations. So because we would like to preserve the pristineness of our own teaching and also what is imparted, because it is from within that teaching that attainment of whatever is the best that is stated in terms of our own religion, our own parampara, that goal shall be attained. If we actually mix it up, then we aren't sure, because there is no authority that indeed can give us that confidence that the kind of efforts that we keep in would indeed result in the desired kind of say fruits that for which, say, these rituals have been instituted. We do find that, say, when it comes to Vidhi and Nishedha, people want the fruit but not follow the Vidhi Nishedhas which are there, is a kind of the ironical situation that our current times place us in. So this was the first one, but there's a second one also that Sankarshana asks. He says, you must not admit into your religions those who take your name in their mouth and then overthrow both scripture and dharma with their wicked behavior. This wicked behavior might as well be a matter which is with respect to, say, embracing a religion for the sake of money and not to take up the kind of ritual, so that whatever is the kind of spiritual enlightenment that each of these say religions shall offer. So this actually is something again that we find is something in the context of a democratic polity that we have, where numbers play a major role, where number becomes an issue, where majorities and minorities are into issues. This particular condition gets equally violated many a times. So now disputants say this too will be done, absolutely, but it does not depend on us. You, sir, and the officers of the king can see it is accomplished. Why? Because, say, if there are people who are admitted into religions, then they are actually done with a say, on the face value. If somebody says, I am interested in, say, joining this religion, or I am interested to convert because I see this good and so on, a person who is actually administering it is not to actually have the ability to also verify. So the disputants say that if in case there is somebody who is using this for personal kind of aggrandizement or kind of, say, selfish furtherance, then that is indeed to be say, curbed by law, by virtue of the stepping in of the person who is in power. So Sankarshana says, you are right, assuredly His Majesty, the King of Kashmir, the instructor is the established rules of in the established rules of social states and life periods, that is Varnashrama Dharmas, grasp the opportunity to do so. So as for you, you must keep yourself apart from such people. Do not sympathize with them. So this is the say the kind of maryada that that Jayanta Bhatta has given in the in 1,000 years ago or so. So we are now placed with, say, a state where we are currently in, and how far we can take this forward is a key question. So I see that we have crossed 7:30, but I am not yet done with the most important part of this. So those of you who would like to stay might as well stay. We can take a short break for a couple of a few minutes, and then we'll come back to specifically before we end this course, recall that memory of Rama Rājya, which is present in Mahabharata, which will indeed give us the kind of points as a kind of summarization of what can be indeed be brooded over. So we'll come back in 3-4 minutes. Better we have another meeting. Well, so we've actually announced for this. So maybe say, since there are recorded versions, we'll certainly share the recorded version. So those who are forced to leave might as well do so, but we'll continue this session now itself so that this comes to a conclusion today. I hope that pleases. Short meeting, yeah, possibly I think say if we can have something during the Navaratras, Chaitra Navaratras, maybe that is possible. But or maybe I could share the slides which can indeed be taken a look at. This is something that we indeed had reference to earlier. So I thought maybe in that case, I'll just skim through those so that we can conclude by 8 o'clock. I hope you're able to see the slides. So this is towards realizing Rāma Rājya, and this, as you see, we have actually said this is the inspiration for us to discuss all this, because the Constitution of India indeed has Rama, who is also treated by law as a constitutional being. So in what manner do we actually consider a polity where this particular illustration is something that serves as the guiding light for the nature of politics, and how one can indeed look at, say, the manner in which, say, this can unfold. So I've already spoken of this Rama Mandira, Rama Rājya, Avinabhava Sambandha, and so on, and this significant exchange whose details I shared with you. So this entire course was actually formulated on a fortunate meeting with say current Pejawara Swāmī-ji, Sri Viśvaprasanna Tīrtha Svāmī-ji, who I happened to ask about the relation between the construction of the current Rama Mandira and Rama Rājya, to which he pointed out that it is indeed something which is highly interconnected. It has Avinabhava Sambandha. But one main point that he indicated that he was reflecting about, say, and he has already made public announcements that the establishment of Rama Rājya is actually the goal, and Rama Mandira is something that is the work towards Rama Mandira is only a beginning. And he has already made a point that since we are in a democracy, we actually have to ensure that each individual strives to be Rama, because Rama is Maryada Purushottama. Rama is the one who is Adarsa Purusha, is the ideal to be emulated. So in that sense, if everybody is striving towards it, then we are indeed moving towards realizing Rama Rājya, such as a formulation that he made. And that was basically from the standpoint of people. But when it comes to the polity, of course, many of the points that we have raised throughout this course indeed become important, because the nature of the structures that are there are different from the kind of specifically the individuals that are actually acting given the kind of structures. And normally speaking, whenever there's a structure, you would find that, say, there will be people who are defenders of the structure because there's inertia. There's something that the structure would indeed help people. There are some people who have benefited from that structure. So even if, say, the structure is detrimental in the long run, those who are currently enjoying the perks of the structures, they would necessarily say stick to them. So to win over such kind of people as well is something that calls for, say, clarity, and that also requires, say, clarity about the nature of systems and these thoughts. That is where, say, the Swarajin ideas is something that becomes important. So, Pejawara Swāmī-ji refers to, say, a specific shloka from Mahabharata Tatparya. It goes, Uttame vachasa siksha madhyamo arthapaharanam adhame dehadandascha tasmad vachyo yudhishthiraha. So the reference is that if there's a corrective mechanism, danda, in fact, danda and dharma go together. When people are classified into uttama, madhyama, and adhama, for an uttama, you can actually correct a person going astray by education. For a madhyama, you can impose a penalty, and an adhama by physical punishment. So given the current times that we live in, where, say, unlimited desire and unrestrained desire is what animates the actions of people, and people are not desirous of appreciating that limits is what would take us to limitless. A rhetorical question posed by His Holiness Sri Viśvaprasanna Tīrtha Swāmī-ji was that, is danda possible at all in current times? See, danda, if at all a person takes it as a matter, I've already pointed out Rama Rājya was the time when, say, people voluntarily asked for danda so that their paraloka is safe. So when such a kind of a formulation is not in the conscious memories of people, and every kind of an activity has a different kind of a narrative in which it is justified, which is the manner in which we see currently happening, is danda possible at all in current times? Is a rhetorical question that Viśvaprasanna Tīrtha Swāmī-ji posed. And it is because of this, unless this state of affairs alters, we can't possibly even think of Rama Rājya. Why Rama Rājya, any sense of a structured polity is possible, is not possible. We might indeed have people use coercive power by police and such forces, but that coercive power would not mean that mentally people would have actually accepted that they have made some kind of a thing which is incorrect and it requires to be corrected. So unless that mental change happens, the same person might as well, say, die without any sense of guilt for having committed a crime or any sense of repentance that is possibly needed. And danda would become useless, though of course it is mechanically exercised. Now, Valmiki, Ramayana has a very important point where Rama cites Manu. He says, Rajabhi Dhృtadandaha Chakritva Papani Manavaha Nirmalaha Swargam Ayanti Santah Sukritinot Yatha. Men who having committed crimes, having been punished by kings, become freed from guilt and go to heaven, just like well-behaved good men. Now, this is a certain kind of a value system or a kind of a belief, which when present, then you have a certain kind of a society that gets built. And Rama further goes on in the same context. He would point out that that king or that Raja who is not actually exercising danda in an instance where it has to be exercised is somebody who would actually be attaining papa, for which he would actually suffer in parloka. Now, this means that, say, the adjudicator, the role of a judge who is, say, taking a call of an extremely important position, because a judge who is not deciding appropriately is acquiring papa. Such is the kind of, say, societal framework in which, say, we find the ancient Indian society found its nourishment. So I have actually quoted from Bhavani Mandir, which is a write-up from Aurobindo Ghosh, because it actually gives a pamphlet. It's a pamphlet which actually says why construction of a mandira is important, and in what is the message that it sends. So you might as well, say, read through that. And now the question is, say, Rama Rājya, the Rama Mandira that is getting constructed, what kind of a message can it send? Can it actually usher in that sense of, say, the citizen as a truth seeker, which indeed is one of the Rama Rājya's memories that we have from Mahabharata Shanti Parva. I've read Diksha earlier. Yeah, so I think again got lost. a second. Yeah, so let me directly this Santushtaha Sarvasithataha Nirbhayaha Swairacharinaha. I have actually pointed out to two Swatantrata and Dharma Nityaha, Dharma Paratantrata. And citizen, when it is taken to mean Nara, which means Nrinanti, Nayanti, Sarvam Swavashamiti Naraha. That is, with one's own effort, one can attain all that is attainable. When citizens are treated as Nara and they are all devoted to a vow of truth, if this Satyavrata is what is actually ushered in, and that is the message that Rama Mandira can give, then I do not see a reason. And if the constitutional framework is also understood in that sense, then the ushering in of Rama Rājya should not be a difficulty at all. And that is something that is inspired by Swarajin ideas. The ideas embodied in a foreign language like that the English language in which the constitution is written are properly understood only when we can express them in our own way. So I have actually brought to your attention about what society ought to be thought of, what secularism needs to be understood as examples, and similarly the questions of liberty, equality, fraternity, and so on. So the ideas embodied in a foreign language are properly understood only when we can express them in our own way. I plead for a genuine translation of foreign ideas into our native ideas before we accept or reject them. Let us everywhere resolutely think in our own concepts. It is only thus that we can think productively on our own account. That is Swarajin ideas. There is, of course, a point that Professor Dayakrishna, in the light of what Swarajin ideas says, has actually spoken about the notions of democracy and justice. So you do find that, say, there are a number of these kind of thoughts which are actually present. And supposing that, say, we indeed make such an effort, then it would indeed be the case that we can, through our efforts, realize Rama Rājya. Whereas if we don't do it, there is anyway a statement that comes from, this is something that is from Yagyavalkya Smriti. So even if the people on earth end up forgetting the Veda Shastras, they would not be lost forever, because there are 88,000 Mahamunis holding on to them. And whenever they disappear from this world, that is when people forget Shastra altogether, these 88,000 Mahamunis who have been entrusted with that task, they are ready to propagate them. And despite being Jivan Muktas, those who have already attained Mukti, and still they actually perform for the sake of the world benefit, they stay along with their families in the Swargaloka to do a favor unto the world. At the end of every Kali Yuga, people turn themselves away from Veda Shastras, and not only do they set aside the Veda Dharmas, but also because they disregard these Mahamunis who are the propagators of Veda Shastras, and since their propagation is no longer amongst people, most of these people end up destroying themselves owing to their excessive greed, intolerance, hatred, anger, envy, and their mutual antagonisms, end up becoming the annihilators of one another. Then these munis take their birth again in this world, and they, with their progeny, will get the practice of Veda Shastras back in vogue. Such is the statement from Yagyavalkya Smriti. Well, this is anyway going to happen if one indeed believes the same, which I do. So the thing is that since we also have the injunction that with our effort, we can ensure that Dharma can stand on all its four legs. And in whichever yuga that we are in, it is Raja who defines which yuga we are part of. Raja hi yugamuchyate, Raja kalasya karanam. It indeed calls for us to reflect on the varieties of things that we have discussed in this course, to be able to build such a sense of past which can indeed give us inspiration to think of the nature of actions that we can do in the present, so that we move towards realizing Rama Rājya. So I thank your presence and your participation. It's been a wonderful exercise to do this exercise of reflecting on Rama Rājya, which is inspired by Jagat Gurus and Pejawara Svāmī-ji. So I bow unto them. And all this is dedicated unto Lord Rama. Apadama pahartaram, dataram sarvasampadam, lokabhiramam Sriramam, puyo puyo namamiham.